Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I don't know if anyone's ever going to truly believe this, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. It was the summer of '78. And back then I thought I was fearless. I guess I was just young and stupid. I grew up in Caldwell Springs, West Virginia, a small place where everyone knew everyone, and we'd always heard these rumors about an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. People said it was haunted, or that strange things were seen inside. Honestly, I never took those stories seriously, but there was something about that weekend. Maybe it was just boredom, maybe curiosity, that pushed me and my friends to see it for ourselves. It was me, Sarah, and Samuel. We were close friends, but we weren't exactly the bravest bunch. Still, that day, we decided we were going to explore the factory. We headed out just before it got dark, because we figured if we went too late at night, we'd spook ourselves for no reason. The place looked rough even from a distance. Broken windows, parts of the roof caved in, rusted metal beams sticking out in odd angles. It felt wrong to be there, but none of us said it out loud. We tried to keep it light, joking around, kicking at loose stones, pretending we weren't nervous. The main doors were jammed, so we found a side opening where the metal had corroded enough that we could squeeze through one by one. Inside, it was quieter than I expected. You know how sometimes old buildings have a constant drip of water, or you can hear animals scurrying? Not this place. It was dead quiet. I clicked on my flashlight, and the beam cut through a layer of dust hanging in the air. Sarah and Samuel did the same, and we just stood there for a moment, trying to get our bearings. The floor was covered in old tools, scraps of wood, twisted wires, and who knows what else. The smell was this stale, slightly metallic odor that made the back of my throat itch. We started to move in deeper, picking our way through scattered debris. I kept feeling like something was off. I could swear the temperature dropped the farther we went. Sarah whispered something about the air feeling heavy, and I could tell from the tightness in Samuel's jaw that he was on edge too. We weren't laughing or joking anymore. Every step made these awful echoes that seemed to spread out in all directions. It felt like we were waking something up with each footstep, something that didn't want us there. It must have been 15, maybe 20 minutes of exploring before we heard it, a sort of scraping noise, like something sharp dragging along metal. At first I thought it might be a loose sheet of corrugated metal blowing in the wind, but then I realized there wasn't any wind inside here. Sarah shot me a look like, "Did you hear that too?" And I just nodded silently. We moved toward the noise, maybe out of some dumb instinct, maybe because we figured it was just the building settling. But the closer we got, the more I felt this tension crawling under my skin. We turned a corner into a long, dim corridor. The light from our flashlights barely touched the far end. There were old lockers along the walls, some dented, some with their doors ripped off. A few rusted machines sat off to the sides, and everything was coated in a fine layer of grime. Then Sarah gasped quietly. I lifted my flashlight and aimed it ahead. Standing way at the other end was something huge. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. It looked like a man, but bigger, much bigger, and covered in dark hair. It had this hulking shape, broad shoulders, long arms. It was just standing there, not moving, but I could feel it looking straight at us. I have no idea how long we stood frozen in that hallway. 10 seconds, a full minute. My heart was hammering so hard I almost thought I'd pass out. Samuel whispered my name and I almost jumped out of my skin. I tried to call out, but no sound came out of my mouth. Then, before I could react, that shape moved. It stepped backward, melting into the shadows, and then it was gone. But I knew it hadn't left. I knew it was still there, maybe hiding just out of the light. I can't explain why I was so sure. It was just a feeling, like when you know someone's behind you even though you can't see them. We didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to bolt and get out right then, but something about that building made it confusing. We started backing away the way we came, but after a couple turns, things stopped looking familiar. Every corridor felt the same, and some doors that we swore we left open were now closed. At one point, Samuel stepped on something that made a loud crack, and that's when we heard a low, guttural sound echo through the halls. It wasn't exactly a growl, but it wasn't human either. It rattled my nerves so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. Sarah grabbed my arm and said, "We have to find a way out." But we had no idea which way was out. We tried to retrace our steps by looking for things we recognized, a broken chair, a pile of scrap metal, but the inside of that place was like a maze. Every passage just led us deeper. Our flashlights felt weaker too, as if the darkness was somehow thicker. I started noticing small signs that we weren't alone, strange footprints in the dust, patches of hair caught on jagged edges of metal, and that smell, like something damp and wild, hidden under the metallic odor. At some point, we found a half-hidden opening behind a set of large pipes. It looked like a maintenance tunnel leading further into the guts of the factory. I didn't want to go in, but we had no idea what else to do. We were panicking. We reasoned that maybe this tunnel would lead to another exit. We crept in single file, our shoulders brushing against rusty pipes and webs clinging to our clothes. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I could also hear something else, like a soft scraping behind us. I didn't want to look back, but I felt if I did, I might see that hairy figure crawling after us. We must have followed that tunnel for a few minutes before it opened into another chamber. This one had old equipment and some collapsed beams that let in a bit of moonlight. It was the first natural light we'd seen in a while. For a second, I was relieved. Then I saw that the dust on the floor was disturbed in strange patterns, like something heavy had been dragged around. There were marks on the walls, too, long scratch marks, as if something had sharpened its claws or tried to dig through the metal. I was starting to think that the stories people told about this place weren't just rumors. Maybe something really did live here. Sarah started crying softly, and I felt my eyes tearing up too. Samuel just looked pale and determined. We didn't say a word, but we all knew we had to keep moving. That's when we heard it again, that low sound, somewhere just out of sight, like it was warning us. I spun around, shining my flashlight into a corner, and for a split second I swear I saw it again, the outline of that massive creature, almost blending perfectly with the shadows. Then it vanished. We ran. I don't even remember making a conscious decision. We just bolted. We slammed through doorways, stumbling over debris, scraping our arms and legs on jagged metal. The fear was like a physical force pushing us forward. We could hear things moving behind us and occasionally to the sides, as if this thing was circling us, guiding us deeper like a predator herding its prey. I remember calling out Sarah's name when I lost sight of her flashlight beam for a moment. Then she appeared again, right beside me, eyes wide and terrified. After what felt like hours, but was probably only another few minutes, we spotted a path that looked more familiar. I recognized a fallen ladder and some rusted barrels we'd passed on the way in. We followed them, running and stumbling until finally we saw a sliver of moonlight that had to be the opening we squeezed through at the start. We didn't dare look back. We pushed through that gap and collapsed outside, breathing heavily, our clothes torn, covered in dirt and sweat. Outside, the night was calm. The chirping of crickets sounded impossibly normal after what we'd just been through. For a long minute, we just lay there on the ground, looking up at the sky, trying to wrap our heads around what happened. Then, without a word, we got up and hurried away from that factory, back toward the lights of town. My heart wouldn't stop pounding even after we'd reached the main road. None of us knew what to say. We never talked about it in detail afterward. Maybe we were afraid people would laugh at us, or maybe we just didn't want to relive it. But I know what I saw. We all saw it. Something big and covered in hair. Something smart enough to stalk us through that building. Something that didn't want us there. People always joked about Bigfoot sightings, or weird creatures lurking in remote places. I never believed any of that until that night. Even now, I can't fully explain what we encountered. I don't know if it was just some huge wild animal that had found shelter in that old factory, or if it was something else entirely. But I know it was real. It felt real. The way it moved, the way it watched us, the sounds it made. It wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't some harmless critter. To this day, I can't drive past that area without feeling a knot in my stomach. I've moved away from Caldwell Springs since then, and so have Sarah and Samuel. We've never gone back to that factory. Last I heard, it's still standing, rotting away, occasionally scaring off anyone dumb enough to poke around. When I think about that night, I get chills. It's not just the memory of seeing that thing. It's the feeling of being hunted, trapped in a place where no one would have found us if we hadn't made it out. I'm sharing this now because I can't shake the idea that we stumbled onto something rare, something that's not supposed to exist. Or maybe it's something that's always existed out there, hidden, just waiting for unlucky idiots like us to wander in. I don't know. All I know is that after that night in the summer of '78, I've never looked at dark, abandoned places the same way again. I still don't have an explanation, and I doubt I ever will. It just happened, and then it stopped, and we escaped. But whatever it was is probably still out there, somewhere in those old ruins, waiting. And that's something I'll never forget. Story 2. I still remember that afternoon in the fall of '82 in Ashland, Oregon, like it happened yesterday. I had just spent an hour or so inside this small, dimly lit pub not far from the edge of town. I had been digging around for local rumors, looking for any strange incidents folks might have heard about the woods nearby. Nothing too dramatic, just odd whispers about something lurking out there. Something people didn't usually talk about unless you pressed them. I'm not easily rattled, but there was a certain tension in the way these stories were mentioned, like everyone knew better than to joke about it. After I left the pub, I decided to head toward the wooded area just outside the town's perimeter. It was late afternoon, the sun already dipping low, casting these long shadows across the old dirt road. I remember thinking how quiet everything seemed. Even though the day was ending, it wasn't just that kind of peaceful quiet. It felt heavy, like the silence you feel in a room full of people who know a secret you don't. As I got closer, I noticed how the forest's edge felt different. The trees looked twisted in a way that could have been natural but somehow felt off. The wind, which had been calm all day, started picking up slightly. Not enough to shake the branches too hard, just enough to whisper through the leaves. I kept moving forward, trying to stay calm, telling myself I was just letting these local legends get into my head. But there was this nagging feeling in my gut. Something about that place made my skin prickle. I've been out in the woods plenty of times, long nights staking out cheating spouses, that kind of thing. But this felt different. I wasn't supposed to be here. That's the feeling I got. Walking deeper, the daylight dimmed faster than I expected. The tall trees blocked most of the remaining light, and the forest floor seemed almost unnaturally dark. I paused every few steps just to listen. That's when I started noticing odd sounds, like branches cracking somewhere ahead, but not in a way that made sense. I'd hear a snap from up in the trees, too high for any normal animal to be messing around. Then a muffled thud behind me. I'd spin around, nothing there. I tried to reason it out. Maybe a deer, maybe something else common to these parts. but the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. At one point, I came across a set of strange marks in the dirt, right near some tangled undergrowth. They weren't exactly footprints in the normal sense, but something had definitely pressed down the soil. They looked more like heavy impressions, bigger than any human's foot, and the pattern was off. It reminded me a bit of a large, bare foot, but not shaped right. I leaned down to get a closer look, and noticed that there were also broken branches higher up, like at 7 or 8 feet from the ground. That didn't make sense. No bear I know breaks branches at that height without climbing, and even then, it wouldn't snap them clean like that. It felt more like something tall just barreled through, leaving a crude path behind. I started getting that sense that I was not alone. It's hard to explain, just that feeling of being watched, like eyes boring into the back of my head. The wind carried this stale, earthy smell, something like damp fur and rotting leaves, heavier than the usual forest scent. I'd never smelled anything quite like it. I swear I heard breathing at one point. Not my own, but something else. A low, steady breathing, as if it was trying to stay quiet and failing. I stopped in my tracks and stood perfectly still, listening, holding my own breath until my lungs burned. The sound faded. Then I heard a soft grunt or maybe a low growl. That's when my heart started pounding in my ears. I thought about calling out, but my throat felt too tight. I've dealt with tricky situations before, angry clients, suspicious spouses confronting me, but none of that prepared me for this. There's a huge difference between human tension and whatever was watching me now. This was primal. Something that went straight to the part of my brain that says, you are not at the top of the food chain here. As I moved further in, I noticed more of those odd signs. Bark stripped off certain trees way higher than I could reach. Large tufts of what might have been hair caught on rough bark. The hairs were dark, thick, not like the fur of any local animal I could name. They smelled musky when I lifted one to my nose. It was a mistake, because after that scent, my stomach twisted, and I had to fight the urge to retch. It was getting dark, and I realized I needed to turn back before I got completely lost. I checked my watch, and time had flown by without me noticing. The dim light had turned to a murky dusk. I tried to retrace my steps, following the path I thought I came in on. That's when something snapped behind me, louder this time. It sounded like a heavy branch breaking under serious weight. I spun around fast. I could barely see anything, just vague silhouettes against the faint evening glow. But something was out there, I was sure of it. I thought I glimpsed a shape between the trees, tall, broad, impossible to mistake for a deer or a bear. It stood there so still, I thought I might be imagining it. Then I heard a low, guttural sound that raised every hair on my body. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I started moving fast, not exactly running, but walking quickly, trying not to lose my footing. As I made my way toward the edge of the woods, the noises continued, branches snapping, rustling in the underbrush, odd heavy footsteps pacing me, never too close, but never letting me feel safe. When I reached a point where I could see the glow of the town lights in the distance, I felt some relief. Whatever was back there seemed reluctant to step out into the open. The moment I emerged from that tree line, I heard nothing more. Just the wind and the distant hum of a car passing somewhere on a nearby road. I glanced back, but I couldn't see anything. There was just darkness and the outline of the trees. Yet, I felt certain something stood there, watching me leave, making sure I didn't come back. Back in town, I found myself shaking. My clothes smelled like the woods, my boots were scuffed, and I had bits of bark and dirt stuck to my sleeves. I remember a few people walking by, normal folks heading home or going out for the night, and I felt completely disconnected from their reality. They had no idea what I'd just experienced. I don't even know how to explain it myself. I had gone looking for a story, but what I found felt too real. It shook me in a way I still can't fully understand. I never found concrete evidence, no clear photographs, no cast of a footprint, nothing I could present to someone and say, "This proves it." Just impressions in the dirt, broken branches, strange hair fibers, and that overpowering sense of dread. Even now, looking back all these years later, I still get chills remembering that feeling of being watched by something large and intelligent enough to keep its distance and still unsettle me at a level I've never felt before. I've returned to Ashland since then, but I never went back into that particular patch of woods. I couldn't shake the sense that whatever was out there didn't want me there, and maybe I was lucky to walk away. Maybe it was just a strange animal or a series of odd coincidences. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like there was something in that forest, something old and wary, something that knew I was an intruder. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced. I don't really care who believes me. All I know is that on that autumn evening in 1982, I came face to face, well, almost, with something I can't define. And ever since then, I've never looked at the quiet woods surrounding that town the same way again. Sometimes I still catch myself wondering what it was, and if it's still out there, hidden behind those twisted trees, watching anyone foolish enough to wander in at dusk. Story 3. I remember that day like it happened yesterday, even though it's been decades. It was the summer of 1975, and I had just wrapped up a long shift at the lumber mill in Greenvale, Maine. By the time I left work, the sun was low, and I was tired, but not in a hurry. I stopped at a small gas station a few miles out of town, one of those old places with a single pump and a grimy window where they sold soda and cigarettes. The air smelled like dust and pine needles. It was quiet, just the distant hum of insects and the faint sound of my car's engine cooling down. While pumping gas, I noticed an old newspaper tucked beside a stack of cheap road maps. The headline caught my eye, something about strange sightings, unexplained noises, and old local legends. It mentioned odd footprints found in the mud, unusual howls, and people swearing they'd seen some kind of large, hairy figure lurking near the forest edges. It sounded ridiculous, like something kids would talk about around a campfire, but I was curious enough to skim a few lines. I don't know why. Maybe I was just bored. Maybe I was in the mood for something different that day. I decided to take a bit of a detour on my way to see my old friend Abigail. She lived deeper in the countryside, surrounded by dense patches of forest and dirt roads that barely looked passable. The idea was simple: go see Abigail, catch up, maybe have a late dinner. But as I drove, the atmosphere started to feel off. It was this strange quiet, not the peaceful kind, but something heavier, like the whole area was holding its breath. It didn't feel like the normal calm of rural Maine. It felt like something was watching. The sky was clear, but the roads were cloaked in a light fog. My headlights cut through it, showing me the narrow path ahead. On any other day, I would have enjoyed this drive, just me and the woods. But that night, the silence felt unnatural. Occasionally I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, a low grunt, something out there just beyond my vision. I tried telling myself it was nothing, just deer, or maybe a bear. But the feeling in my gut was different. It was like the woods themselves didn't want me there. When I finally reached Abigail's place, she greeted me on the porch. We were old friends, but that night she looked as uneasy as I felt. She didn't say much, just a hey and a nod, like she knew something was off too. Her cabin was small, set against a stand of pines, and there was no phone service out there worth mentioning. If we needed help, we'd have to drive back into town. I remember the way the flashlight beams shook in our hands. We hadn't planned on poking around in the dark, but the sounds grew harder to ignore. Low, muffled movements from somewhere between the trees, like something heavy shifting its weight. Branches cracking with no wind. It was quiet enough that every small sound felt magnified. We decided to take a look around, if only to calm our nerves. We kept near the tree line, scanning the ground for any signs of an animal. Abigail held her flashlight low, illuminating the dirt and pine needles. That's when we saw these impressions. I can't call them normal footprints because they were weird, large, a strange shape, not quite a bear's paw, but not a human foot either. They were spaced out oddly, like something with a heavy, upright stance had moved through there. I remember how my stomach knotted up, and Abigail's flashlight beam trembled a bit. Neither of us said it out loud, but we were thinking the same thing. Maybe there was truth in those headlines I'd read. We moved cautiously, trying not to make noise. The fog seemed thicker among the trees. It was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We'd shine our lights and only catch glimpses of branches and moss. But sometimes, I swear I saw a shape duck behind a trunk, or a dark outline slip away just as I turned my head. Abigail must have seen it too, because at one point she reached out and grabbed my arm, firm, without a word, like she was saying, "Yes, I see it." The smell was strange too. There was a rank odor in some spots, like wet fur and rot, something that didn't belong to any normal animal around here. I grew up hunting deer and knew what the woods smelled like. This was different, heavier and somehow intelligent. That probably sounds stupid, but that's the best way I can describe it. It felt like we weren't just encountering an animal's musk. It felt like something was intentionally lingering, leaving a scent behind. A few times we heard these low, guttural sounds. Not loud enough to call a roar, but not anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf's howl or a bear's grunt. It almost sounded like muttering, as if something large was breathing and growling at the same time. Every hair on my neck stood on end. Abigail looked at me with eyes wide, and I could feel her fear as clearly as my own. As the night dragged on, the tension grew. We circled back toward the cabin, trying to stay close to the safety of the porch light, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Once, the beam of my flashlight caught a pair of eyes reflecting in the distance. High up, taller than any normal animal's eye level. They blinked and were gone before I could focus. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Abigail whispered something under her breath. It sounded like a prayer, but I'm not sure. We didn't dare speak loudly. It was getting close to dawn when we finally decided we'd had enough. There was no point in going deeper into the woods. We had no weapons besides a flashlight and a useless pocket knife. If something was out there, something that stood on two legs and left bizarre footprints, we weren't equipped to handle it. We retreated to the cabin, locked the doors, and listened from inside. Every so often I'd hear a twig snap outside or the faintest shuffle of movement. It was like waiting out a storm, except the storm was alive and watching us. Eventually, things got quieter. The sky began to lighten, and the silence turned back into something normal. Just the distant hum of insects and an early bird or two. Abigail and I didn't talk much about it afterward. When the sun was fully up, I said my goodbyes and got back into my car. I tried to convince myself it was just some big animal, maybe a bear acting strangely, or a pair of them moving around. But I knew that wasn't right. The footprints were too odd, the sounds too unsettling, and that feeling, that oppressive, intelligent presence, stuck with me. I never really figured out what we encountered. I never reported it to anyone. It's not the kind of story you bring up casually. Who would believe us? Back then, we didn't have phones to snap a quick photo, and even if we had, I'm not sure it would have helped. The memory of those heavy footprints and that unsettling smell is all I have. It creeps into my mind sometimes, late at night, and I can still feel that prickling tension on my skin. I guess that's it. Nothing dramatic happened at the end. We didn't see it clearly, we weren't attacked, and it didn't chase us. But I know what I felt. To this day, I can't explain it. and I still wonder what was out there in those woods, watching us, deciding whether to show itself fully or just vanish back into the trees. I never got an answer, and I doubt I ever will. Story 4. I know this might sound crazy, but I swear every word of this is exactly how I remember it. Back in 1984, I was in Pottsville, Kentucky, and I'd become a bit obsessed with exploring old, abandoned buildings. It wasn't some professional gig or anything. I was just a 20-something guy who liked poking around places that people forgot. There was this old asylum on the edge of town that I'd heard about, a place that shut down decades before, rumored to have housed patients in rough conditions. I'm not talking about chain-link fences and cruel experiments, just a rundown old hospital that didn't make it through time and budget cuts. Everyone said it was just empty halls, broken windows and trash. I thought, why not? And decided to check it out on a Saturday afternoon. I remember it was an overcast day. The sky was that dull gray that makes everything feel heavier. I parked my old truck a good distance away because I didn't want anyone seeing me sneaking around there. A lot of people got spooked by the place, and I wasn't sure if it was entirely legal to go inside. But anyway, I made my way through the overgrown brush, climbed over a rusted fence, and found an old side door that had been busted open long before I got there. Inside, the air felt stale and thick, like a basement that's been closed up for years. My flashlight beam bounced around on peeling paint and flickering shadows. The halls were a mess, old papers scattered on the floor, a few metal bed frames shoved against walls, medical cabinets with their doors hanging open. There was nothing immediately terrifying, just a big old building that smelled like mold and dust. The silence got to me, though. In big, empty spaces, every step you take sounds like a gunshot, and your breathing echoes. I tried to keep quiet, but each footstep seemed magnified. The weirdness started when I passed a small office room. I noticed some old patient files spread across a desk. I picked one up out of curiosity, flipping through pages with medical terms I didn't understand. Suddenly, I heard this sound, like something tapping, maybe metal against concrete. It was distant, but it made me freeze. My first thought was, maybe it was just a piece of loose guttering outside or an animal moving around on the upper floors. But as I stood there, it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. I moved on, trying to ignore that feeling that I wasn't alone. A few rooms later, I started hearing what sounded like footsteps echoing down the hall behind me. Every time I turned around, I saw nothing, just that long corridor fading into darkness. The feeling of being watched got stronger, not like I was being stalked by a person. Something felt off, like the presence wasn't fully human. I can't fully explain that. It just felt different, as if whoever, or whatever, was there didn't move or think like us. Things got even stranger when I found the entrance to the basement. The stairs were creaky and steep, and I remember the smell changing. It got worse, musty and rotten, like something had died down there a long time ago. In that dim light, I followed my flashlight beam, and I saw furniture arranged in these really odd patterns. Chairs stacked in a strange pyramid, desks shoved into corners at weird angles, and old tattered blankets piled up like some kind of makeshift nests. The arrangement wasn't random. Someone, or something, had done this deliberately. It reminded me of stories I'd read about animals or creatures trying to make a shelter, but in a crude, unsettling way. I started to think maybe a homeless person or a group of squatters were living there, but if that were the case, why would they leave these bizarre setups, and why so silent? My hair stood on end, and I had this urge to leave immediately. As I turned to head back upstairs, I heard a low grunt. It wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, and it made my chest tighten. I froze, shining my flashlight around desperately. In the corner, Near a half-collapsed doorway, I swear I caught a glimpse of something tall and broad, covered in dark, matted hair. I only saw it for a split second, because as soon as my light hit it, it jerked back behind the doorframe. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a pile of debris, or maybe my mind playing games. But I knew what I saw. Something big, maybe 7 feet tall, with shoulders like a linebacker and arms that seemed way too long. It moved silently, almost gracefully, and yet it felt heavy. The floorboards groaned lightly after it vanished, suggesting serious weight. I whispered, "Hello," even though I knew I wouldn't get an answer. Nothing, just the quiet hum of my own pulse in my ears. I walked backward, step by step, keeping my flashlight pointed at the corner where I'd seen it. Then another noise, a sort of guttural huffing, made me whip my head around. For a second, I could have sworn I saw a large, shadowy silhouette slip behind a row of old cabinets. It moved in a strange way, like it was both curious and cautious, watching me, circling around. I'm not going to lie, my eyes started to water and my heart was pounding like crazy. I felt trapped. The only exit I knew was back the way I came, and that seemed to be where this thing was lurking. Trying to stay calm, I decided to just go for it, move fast, but not run blindly. My flashlight flickered a bit. I guess I was shaking, and I kept it aimed toward the dark corners ahead. At the top of the basement stairs, I nearly slipped on some old papers. When I steadied myself, I saw footprints, big ones, on the dusty floor. They weren't boot prints. They looked more like huge, bare footprints with toes splayed out. My stomach dropped. I know what human footprints look like, and these were not human. It reminded me of the casts I'd seen in those weird Bigfoot documentaries, the kind you catch late at night on some random channel. But I was in an old asylum, not the deep woods. It made no sense. I tried to push that thought away and focused on getting out. I started to hear the footsteps again, now heavier, more deliberate. It sounded like it was following me at a distance, never too close but never too far, like it was herding me toward the exit. There were no words, no growls chasing me, just this eerie presence and the occasional shuffle of something large moving behind walls and doors. By the time I reached the main floor, I felt dizzy from fear. The light outside was weaker now, like the clouds had thickened. I hurried back down the hall, following my own footprints in the dust, and as I neared the door I'd entered through, I caught another glimpse of it. At the far end of a long hallway, where a row of broken windows let in just enough light, I saw a massive figure standing there. It was hunched slightly, its head nearly touching a broken lamp fixture that hung from the ceiling. I couldn't make out details of its face. It was just a large silhouette covered in thick, dark hair, staring at me. It didn't charge, didn't roar. It just watched. Maybe it was checking if I was going to leave. I didn't wait. I bolted outside, tripping over a chunk of concrete and smacking my knee on the pavement. I didn't even feel the pain at first. I was too scared. I got to my truck, started it with shaking hands, and got the hell out of there as fast as I could. I remember looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it lumbering out of the building and into the overgrown yard. But there was nothing. Just that quiet, empty asylum behind me. For days after, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a homeless man dressed in animal skins or a prankster in a ghillie suit. But the size and shape of it, those footprints, the arrangement of furniture in the basement, it didn't fit. I told a few close friends and they laughed it off, saying I'd been creeped out by the old place and let my imagination run wild. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it was no person. I never went back. To this day, I still think about it. It wasn't the sort of cliché Hollywood monster that snarls and chases you. It felt real. Something that lived there, hidden, smart enough to rearrange objects, quiet enough to stalk me without fully revealing itself. And after I left, life in Pottsville went on as usual. No one reported any sightings. No one talked about a giant creature in the old asylum. It's like it never happened. But I know it did. And even now I can't explain it. I just know I was never alone in that building. Something was there. Something I still can't put a name to. Story 5. I remember it was sometime in late autumn of 1976, maybe a week or two after I'd moved into that tiny apartment in Harrington Falls, Vermont. I was still adjusting to the slower pace of the town. Fewer cars, fewer people, and this odd hush over everything once the sun dipped behind those thickly wooded hills. It felt good to slow down after years of stress, but I couldn't ignore the strange stories I'd been hearing. Almost everyone I talked to hinted at something wandering around the outskirts, something that wasn't exactly a bear or a person. They rarely said Bigfoot out loud, but that's what they meant. I'm not a superstitious guy, but I couldn't shake off how casually they mentioned it, as if it was part of the landscape. I guess my curiosity got the best of me. One afternoon, right around dusk, I decided to check out that old shed people seemed to reference. Apparently, it stood at the edge of town, half collapsed, just a short walk beyond a narrow dirt road that hardly anyone used. The rumor was that strange noises came from inside at night, and that more than once someone had caught a glimpse of a large shape passing behind it. I didn't believe it fully, but I had nothing better to do. I grabbed my flashlight. Not a fancy one, just a cheap metal one I'd picked up at the hardware store, and started walking. The path leading there was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you. The trees crowded close, and the moonlight barely filtered through. There was this smell in the air, a damp, earthy odor that made me think of rotting leaves and old wood. After about 20 minutes, I found the shed. It looked worse than I'd imagined, like it might collapse if the wind blew too hard. The planks were warped and blackened with age, and the door hung awkwardly on one hinge. I remember pausing outside, feeling this weird, heavy pressure in my chest, like I was about to open a door I shouldn't. When I stepped inside, it was even darker. The beam of my flashlight trembled a bit because my hand was shaking, and I told myself to get a grip. There were old tools leaning against the walls, rusted saws, broken handles, cobwebs thick in every corner. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and each step sounded so loud that I felt like I was announcing myself to whoever, or whatever, might be in there. I tried to laugh it off. I even whispered something to myself like, "There's nothing here." But it came out too quiet, like I was afraid to be heard. The smell inside was worse, a heavy animal scent mixed with old dust. The atmosphere was so tense it was hard to explain. It felt like I'd walked into a room right after a fight had broken out. This charged feeling, like something had happened moments before I arrived. I noticed odd marks on the wood, scratches that looked too high to be from a raccoon or some small animal. They were spaced oddly, almost like fingers. I ran my hand over them and couldn't figure out what made them. My fingertips came away with tiny splinters. Then I heard this soft shuffle behind me. It wasn't loud, more like a subtle shift of weight on old floorboards. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly, but I saw nothing. The darkness beyond my flashlight beam felt suffocating. I stood there for a moment, holding my breath, waiting to hear it again. Nothing. Just silence. I took a step forward, and another board squeaked, but differently this time, and I realized the noise I'd first heard didn't come from my own movement. Something else had moved. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a squirrel got in here. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a squirrel. I found myself straining my ears, trying to pick up any subtle sounds. And then came this faint sound, almost like breathing but heavier, deeper. It lasted only a second or two. My heart started pounding so loud I worried it might drown out whatever I was listening for. I took a few careful steps into a darker corner of the shed, aiming the flashlight at the floor. That's when I noticed footprints, not shoe prints, and not quite bear tracks either. The boards were dusty, and something big and heavy had left vaguely human-like footprints there. The toes looked wrong, too wide, too spread out. I crouched down, trying to make sense of it. My chest tightened, and my knees felt weak. I was alone in that shed, with no weapon and no plan, standing over strange prints that couldn't belong to any animal I knew. A sudden scraping noise came from the far end of the shed, near some old stacked crates. My flashlight flicked over there, and for just a split second I caught a glimpse of something moving. I can't say I saw it clearly. I only saw a dark shape pulling back, like it darted behind something. It was tall, definitely taller than me. I'm not a short man, and this thing seemed to tower. My flashlight flickered, which scared the hell out of me, and I smacked it with my palm to keep it going. I remember feeling this primal fear, like I was trespassing in a place I didn't belong. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I started backing up toward the door, never taking my eyes off that corner. I whispered, "I'm leaving," though I'm not sure why I said it out loud. Maybe I hoped it would understand I meant no harm. As I made my way back to the doorway, I heard a low, guttural sound, almost like a grunt or a growl. It was so deep I felt it in my bones. I turned and ran. I know that's not what a tough guy would do, but I wasn't trying to be tough. I just wanted out of there. I ran out into the cool night air and slammed into the overgrown bushes outside. Twigs scratched my face. The flashlight beam jerked all over the place as I stumbled down the path back to town, barely able to keep my footing. On the way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. I thought I heard something following me, heavy footsteps crashing through the brush, but I can't be sure. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, but at the time, I was convinced it was behind me. I didn't stop until I saw the distant glow of the streetlights near the center of town. Once I reached those lights, the sense of relief almost made me collapse. I stood there, panting, trying to understand what had just happened. Later that night, when I tried to talk about it to a couple of locals I'd gotten friendly with, they didn't seem surprised. They just nodded slowly and told me not to go poking around places I shouldn't. They didn't mock me, but they didn't press for details either. It was as if everyone in Harrington Falls knew something was out there, but chose to ignore it. Or maybe they'd all had their own encounters and knew that there was no point in trying to explain it. They acted like it was just one more thing you had to accept if you chose to live here. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dim interior of that shed and felt that overwhelming presence. I kept thinking about those footprints and that half glimpse of something massive and alive, breathing in the darkness. That sound it made, that low, rumbling breath, still makes the hairs on my neck stand up just remembering it. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I never went back to that shed. I never tried to get a better look. I didn't need proof. Whatever it was real enough to scare me more than anything else I've encountered. And what's worse is how ordinary everything looked afterward. Harrington Falls didn't change. People went on with their lives, quiet and calm, as if the strange and the normal coexisted there without any fuss. I guess I learned that sometimes you stumble across things you can't wrap your head around, and life just goes on like nothing happened. Even now, decades later, I still remember that day clearly. I can't shake the feeling that something was in that shed with me, something no one's supposed to see. I left it behind that night, but it never fully left my mind. I suppose it's just one of those things that happens and then disappears, leaving you wondering what the hell it was and why it chose that moment to show itself. I don't have any answers, and no one in Harrington Falls ever gave me any. It was just something that happened, there and gone, and I still don't know what to make of it. Story 6. Back in 1979, when I was working in Linwood, Montana, I had this delivery job that took me into the mountains a lot. It was nothing fancy, just driving around, dropping off supplies at a few remote spots near a large lake. It was a calm place most of the time, and I never thought anything strange could happen there. I remember that day like it was yesterday because it still freaks me out when I think about it. I had just finished my last delivery earlier than usual. The sun was getting low, and I figured I'd enjoy a quick walk around the lake before heading back. The place looked really peaceful at first. The water was shimmering under the orange light of the setting sun, and there was a quietness that I actually liked. I parked my truck by one of the small docks, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and wandered along the shoreline, taking in the view. It was a moment I was hoping would help me unwind. At some point, I got curious about a trail I'd seen before, but never bothered to explore. It was narrow, not used much, running off into the woods behind the dock area. As I stepped onto it, there was this sudden tension in the air, like the atmosphere thickened, you know. It's hard to explain, but the silence turned weird. The rustling of leaves sounded off, and I had that gut feeling that I wasn't alone. I know it sounds cliché, but I swear something was watching me. I'm not talking about a person standing behind a tree. It felt more primal, like some large animal lurking just out of sight. I kept walking a bit further, and that's when I started hearing these odd noises. They weren't loud, more like low grunts or heavy breathing. Sometimes I heard something like branches snapping, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. The woods weren't too dense, but the underbrush and the fading light made it almost impossible to see clearly. I was scanning between the trunks, trying to spot any movement, but all I got was this creeping sense of dread. After a couple of minutes, I decided this was pointless. I wasn't armed, I had no flashlight, and the sun was going down fast. I backed away and headed toward the dock again. The closer I got to the open area by the lake, the better I felt. But that uneasy feeling didn't vanish. I felt like something followed me to the edge of the woods and just stopped there, watching. When I reached the dock, I noticed a fisherman. He looked local, rough jacket, old boots, that kind of guy. I approached him, not really sure what to say. I mentioned hearing weird noises in the woods, hoping he might tell me it was just a bear or a moose. He kind of shrugged, not even bothered, and mumbled something like, "You're not the first to say that." He didn't give me any details, and he didn't seem interested in talking about it. It was like he'd heard it all before and didn't care to elaborate. His reaction freaked me out more than the noises themselves. It was as if strange things happened around there all the time, and the locals just accepted it. I tried to shake it off. I walked along the shoreline a bit, staying in the open so I could see all around me. The temperature was dropping, and the wind picked up slightly. I remember my hands shaking, but I don't know if it was the cold or my nerves. I kept looking back at the tree line, expecting something or someone to step out. I never saw anything clear, but once I thought I caught a glimpse of a tall, dark shape moving behind the trees. It was quick, just a shift of a silhouette, but it was big, taller than any person I'd met out there. Whatever it was, it moved so smoothly that I almost doubted my own eyes. I decided I'd had enough. It didn't feel safe. I went to my truck, climbed in, and locked the doors. Just as I was about to start the engine, I heard a loud crack from somewhere behind me. I turned my head and saw branches shaking a few yards into the forest. It was too dark to see clearly, but something was definitely there, something with mass, something that could snap thick branches without much effort. I wasn't going to go back and investigate. My heart was pounding, and all I wanted was to get the hell out of there. Right before I drove off, I had the headlights facing the tree line. For a split second, I swear I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light, high off the ground, maybe at the height of a tall man, maybe taller. I didn't see any detail, just that reflective glare you get when you shine a flashlight at an animal. Except this felt different. The eyes seemed set straight on me, not off to the side like a deer or something just wandering by. These eyes were locked on me, watching every move I made. I slammed the gas and got out of there. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something step out onto the road behind me, but nothing did. The drive back was silent. No radio, no music. I was just trying to process what had happened. I didn't stop until I reached my temporary lodging, and even there I couldn't settle down. I kept replaying the whole thing in my head. Every little sound, every odd movement, the fisherman's shrug, the shape between the trees, the eyes in the dark. I never told my co-workers the full story, just said I got spooked by an animal. I didn't want them thinking I was nuts. It's not like I had proof, and back in those days, who was going to believe me anyway? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something huge and intelligent was out there. I'd heard rumors of strange sightings in the Montana wilderness, but I never took them seriously before. Now I'm not sure what to believe. All I know is what I felt that day was real, and whatever it wasn't just my imagination. Over time, I tried to brush it off as just a weird encounter with a bear or something unknown. But deep down, I know bears don't move like that or stare at you from a distance with that kind of intensity. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or some other creature people like to talk about. I just know I felt like prey. I felt watched, cornered, and sized up by something that felt more human than animal, yet not quite either. After that day, I never went back to that specific trail. I stuck to my work routes, did my deliveries, and went home. I tried to pretend everything was normal. The weird thing is that I never had another incident like that. No more strange noises, no more dark figures. It was like that encounter was a one-time thing, something that happened and then vanished from my life. Yet even now I still remember it clearly, and I can't explain it. I'm sharing this now because I've never really gotten over the feeling of that afternoon by the lake, back in '79. I can't prove anything, and I won't try. All I can say is that something was out there. Something I can't put a name on. And that one brief encounter changed the way I look at the woods and what might be hiding just beyond our sight. It came out of nowhere and ended just as suddenly, leaving me with more questions than answers. I've learned to live with that, but I'll never forget how it felt. Story 7. I still remember that day in Chesterfield, Ohio, back in 1981, like it just happened. I'd been staying at this small inn for a couple of weeks, trying to clear my head from my usual city life. The place was quiet, tucked between dense woods and rolling hills, and people seemed friendly enough, though not too open about the weird stuff I kept hearing whispers about. There were these stories, about something lurking in the woods. Some talked about missing farm animals, strange tracks and odd noises at night. No one came right out and said it was some kind of monster, but I could feel the tension whenever I tried to bring it up. It was all side glances and changing the subject. I didn't want to push it. I'm no expert on local legends, and I sure as hell didn't want to pick a fight with the people who lived there. But curiosity got the better of me. I started taking these walks along the edge of the forest and near a shallow lake just outside town. At first, everything seemed normal, just trees, birds, rustling leaves. But as the afternoon turned to early evening on this one particular day, the atmosphere shifted. It's hard to explain. The air felt thicker, heavier, and there was this odd silence. The kind where it seems like every animal out there has decided to shut up all at once. I was walking along a narrow dirt trail near the edge of the woods. The inn wasn't too far behind me, maybe a 15-minute walk, but it felt like I'd gone deeper. I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like when someone's watching you from behind. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, I just saw trees and shadows. The light was fading, the sun dipping behind the hills, and that's when I heard this low grunt. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough to make me freeze. It wasn't human. I know what a person sounds like, even if they're trying to be quiet. This was deeper, like a big animal, but not one I could name. I stood still, barely breathing as I listened. I heard movement, something heavy shifting its weight. It sounded like it was just out of sight, behind a cluster of thick shrubs to my right. I crept forward, not sure what the hell I was thinking, but I had this urge to see what it was. Maybe a bear, I thought. But something in my gut told me it wasn't a bear. I'd seen bears before on camping trips. This felt different. It felt more aware, like it knew I was there and was waiting for me to make a move. I took another careful step, craning my neck, and then I saw it. I didn't get a perfect look, but enough to burn it into my memory. It was tall, covered in dark, matted hair, hunched over, but clearly standing on two legs. The shape of its shoulders and neck, the way its head sat low but still turned slightly in my direction. It was all wrong. Too broad, too thick. I couldn't see its face clearly. The fading light and the branches obscured it. But I saw enough of its outline to know I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, but I was terrified that running would trigger something, so I just stood there, frozen, as this thing let out another low grunt, softer this time, almost like it was testing me. I could smell something too, like wet fur and old dirt, a heavy, musky odor that filled my nostrils. My mind was racing. Should I slowly back away? Should I try to look bigger, like you do with a wild animal? I didn't know. Then it took a step. I heard the snap of a twig, the crunch of damp leaves. I caught a glimpse of its leg, thick, powerful, more human-like than I wanted to admit, covered in hair that was darker near the skin. The arms were long, hanging down in a way that reminded me of an ape, but it was taller than any ape I'd ever seen in a zoo. This thing was massive, and I was alone with it, with no weapons, no plan, no one even knowing exactly where I was. I started to back up, my hands out in front of me as if that would do any good. My foot slipped on something, a small rock or a patch of loose soil, and I made a noise. Not loud, but enough. The creature's head jerked in my direction, and for a split second I saw its eyes reflect what little light was left. They weren't glowing or anything like that, just reflecting, but I saw intelligence in them. I swear I saw understanding, and maybe even surprise. It breathed out loudly, almost like a sigh, and I felt a rush of adrenaline that made my legs shake. I took another step back, slow and steady, and it took another step forward. I thought, this is it. I've made a terrible mistake. But then it just stopped. For a long moment we both stood there, locked in this tense standoff, neither of us moving. My heart was hammering, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, even though it wasn't that warm. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It felt like hours, but it was probably just a few seconds. Then, as if it had decided something, the creature turned. It moved so smoothly for something that large, stepping off into the deeper brush, vanishing almost instantly into the shadows of the forest. I heard it moving away, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, getting quieter and quieter until the silence returned. I stood there, stunned. I didn't dare follow. I didn't even want to stay there another second. I turned around and hurried back to the inn, practically tripping over my own feet. I could barely breathe until I saw the dim lights of the porch and the outline of the old building. Inside my room, I locked the door, leaning against it, trying to make sense of what happened. I didn't sleep well that night, too jumpy at every sound. I kept expecting to see that thing outside my window, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I tried to tell myself I imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me. But I know what I saw. I remember that smell. I remember those heavy footsteps, that broad shape moving between the trees, and the strange sense that it was studying me as much as I was studying it. I wanted to ask someone about it, but I knew they'd just shrug it off or give me that look, so I never did. I left Chesterfield not long after. I never found out if anyone else had seen something like that, or if it was behind the missing animals. Maybe I was just another outsider who caught a glimpse of something that's not supposed to be real. Even today, I can't shake the memory. It scares me and fascinates me at the same time. I still wonder what I encountered that evening. I haven't been back to those woods, and I doubt I ever will. I carry that memory around, knowing it happened, even though I can't explain it. It was there one moment, and gone the next, leaving me with more questions than answers. Story 8. I remember that summer day in 1985 like it just happened. I had decided to head out for a walk in the woods near Galesburg, Illinois, something I didn't usually do, but that week had been rough. I'd been feeling too wound up, too tense. The idea was simple: clear my head, get some fresh air, maybe follow one of the quieter trails I'd been told about. Nothing fancy. It was just supposed to be a walk. The start of the afternoon was actually pretty nice. The weather was warm, but not stifling. You could still feel a gentle breeze cutting through the trees. I remember noticing how calm it all seemed. Light filtering through the leaves, a slight shimmer on the distant creek, birds calling quietly in the canopy. It looked exactly like any postcard scene you'd expect from a small-town forest. I followed a narrow trail that I knew looped back around to the main path, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. Everything was peaceful at first, but as the afternoon wore on, something shifted. It wasn't like a sudden noise or a dramatic event. It was more subtle. I started feeling watched, and believe me, I've tried to talk myself out of this feeling 1,000,000 times over the years, but it was real. It's like the forest just went quiet in patches. The birds would stop singing unexpectedly, or the wind would die down for a moment, and then I'd catch myself holding my breath. I know how it sounds, but I swear, there were these moments where I felt tension in the air, as if someone, or something, was paying attention to me. And I couldn't see anyone else around, no hikers, no reason to feel like I was being spied on. At first, I brushed it off. I tried joking with myself in my head, thinking of silly excuses like maybe I was just jumpy from too much coffee that morning. I kept walking. The trail was narrow and wound through tall, old trees. Eventually, I reached a sort of clearing, not fully open, but a spot where the undergrowth thinned out, and I could see a bit more of the forest floor around me. That's when I noticed something strange, a cluster of branches and sticks arranged in a way that didn't feel natural. I'm not talking about a neat, obvious structure like a teepee, just a handful of thick branches twisted and wedged between two trees at a height that seemed odd. It's hard to explain, but it looked too deliberate to be random deadfall. The bark was scraped in places, almost as if something had tried to bend or manipulate them. I stood there, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't see footprints, but the ground in that area was covered with old leaves and moss, not exactly ideal for catching a clear print. But I swear some of those leaves looked pushed aside, maybe recently. The whole arrangement felt out of place, like I'd stumbled into someone else's spot. I've seen makeshift shelters built by kids or hunters leaving markers, but this didn't feel like that. It felt rougher, less thought out, more brute force than crafty. I remember getting a chill down my spine, even though the afternoon was still warm. Something about it just made me uneasy. I considered turning around right then, but there was this stubborn part of me that didn't want to be scared off by a few branches. That's when I heard it, a snap of a twig or branch somewhere off to my left. I froze, scanning the trees. It could have been a deer, I told myself. But then I heard what sounded like a low grunt, almost like something large shifting its weight. It wasn't a human sound. It was deeper, more resonant, like a big animal clearing its throat. Except I couldn't see any animal. Nothing moved, at least not that I could pinpoint. I felt my heart rate jump. I tried to keep calm. I'd spent enough time outdoors to know that wildlife can be unpredictable, but it usually wants nothing to do with humans. Still, I kept thinking, what if it's a bear? But black bears weren't exactly common in that area, at least not that I'd ever heard. And if it was just a deer, why would I feel so uneasy? The sound didn't fit with what I knew of local wildlife. I slowly backed away, turning to head back the way I came, and as I did, I heard another noise, this time behind me. It sounded like a branch snapping underfoot. Heavy foot. For a second my mind flashed with the image of a large figure crouching in the greenery, watching me, waiting. I wanted to catch a glimpse, even though every nerve in my body told me I should just run. But running would be stupid. I tried to keep my pace steady, pretending I was calm, though I could feel the hair on my neck standing up. The further I walked, the more I sensed it. Something was tracking me. Not constantly, not always in sight. But there were these faint crackles, these almost muffled thumps. A few times I swore I heard a breathy exhale. It was too measured, too quiet to be random. At one point, I caught a glimpse of movement through the trees, just a flash of something dark and tall, moving quickly out of sight. It was so fast and so brief that I nearly convinced myself I imagined it. But I know I saw something. It moved on 2 legs, not 4. That's what shook me the most. It didn't look like a person, at least not like any person I'd ever seen. It was bigger. I didn't see details, just a silhouette, but it felt massive. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every step I took, I expected something to lunge at me. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that I'd get back to the main trail, where more people might be around. I tried not to think about what I'd seen. Just focus on getting out, I told myself. Just keep moving. The forest around me felt different now, as if the normal rhythm of the place had shifted. I couldn't hear any birds anymore, no distant rustle of squirrels, nothing but my own breathing and those occasional haunting hints that I was not alone. After what felt like an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than half an hour, I reached a part of the trail I recognized. The light was fading faster than I expected. The summer sun was still out, but the canopy made it feel later than it was. I tried to pick up my pace without making too much noise. I was torn between wanting to run and not wanting to provoke whatever might be out there. My instincts were screaming at me, telling me I didn't belong here, that I'd stepped into something's territory and it was making its presence known. Then came the moment that still haunts me. I heard a deep, guttural grunt so close behind me that I practically jumped out of my skin. I spun around, expecting to see something towering right there. But again, nothing. Just trees and undergrowth. I could smell something odd, though. An earthy, musky odor, like sweat and damp fur. I'd never smelled anything like it before, and to this day I can still recall it. It was unpleasant and strong, not just a whiff, but like I'd walked through a pocket of it lingering in the air. I forced myself to keep going. My legs felt shaky, and my hands were clammy with sweat. Every time I thought I was putting distance between me and whatever it was, I'd hear another subtle snap or catch another glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. It never fully showed itself. It stayed just out of sight, close enough to terrify me, but far enough that I could never say with absolute certainty what it looked like. By the time I got close to the trailhead, where the forest starts to thin out near a gravel path, the sounds stopped. The feeling of being watched started to fade. It was like stepping across some invisible boundary. One moment I was gripped by an overwhelming sense of being hunted, and the next I found myself in a slightly more open area, with faint sounds of distant traffic drifting in from beyond the trees. I almost cried with relief, but I also felt dizzy, like I'd just escaped something that I can never fully explain. I stood there for a minute, catching my breath, trying to piece together what had happened. Part of me wanted to run back to town and tell someone, anyone, that there was something out there. But who would believe me? I didn't have proof. I hadn't seen a face or a body in clear daylight, just silhouettes and hints. Still, those branches twisted in that unnatural way, that horrible smell, that feeling of being followed by something powerful and intelligent. It all rattled me. Over the following days, I confided in a few friends. They mostly shrugged it off, laughing or giving me that look that says, "You got spooked by a deer or something." I nodded along, pretending maybe that's all it was. But I know what I felt. I know that something was tracking me that day, something that didn't want to be seen, something that deliberately let me know it was there, just not fully visible. It never attacked me, but it made sure I felt cornered and vulnerable in a place I had thought was peaceful. To this day, I can't say for sure what it was. Some people talk about Bigfoot sightings around the country, hairy, tall creatures that stay hidden and rarely show themselves. I never saw hair or a face up close, but I can't dismiss that possibility. Whatever it was large, strong, and smart enough to stay out of sight, but close enough to scare the hell out of me. I've walked other trails in other places since then, but I've never felt that kind of watchful presence again. It left me with this lingering doubt, this sense that we really don't know everything that's out there. Even all these years later, I still think about that day in those woods near Galesburg. Sometimes I recall those twisted branches and wonder if they were some sort of sign or marker, something that creature left behind. Sometimes I remember that musky odor and feel queasy, like I've just smelled it again. It's stuck with me, this weird experience I can't fully explain or forget. Nothing else happened after that. The forest went back to being just a patch of green on the outskirts of a quiet town. But for me, that place will always carry a sense of mystery, a silent reminder that we share this world with things we don't understand. And that's all I've got. It happened, it ended, and I never got any clear answers. I just know I walked into those woods looking for peace and found something else entirely. That's the truth, as best as I can tell it. I still get chills remembering it. Sometimes I wish I had never gone off the beaten path that day. But I did, and what I experienced changed the way I think about the places that seem familiar and safe. Because maybe, just maybe, they're not as empty as we think. Story 9. I remember that day in Somerville, back in late September of 1977, like it happened last week. It was supposed to be just another outing with my camera. I'd been exploring the outskirts of town for a while, trying to document rare animals and hidden spots that might give me something different for my photography portfolio. The forests around Somerville were older than I could wrap my head around, and I knew there were caves further in, places most people never bothered to visit. I wasn't scared, just curious. I guess that's what led me to that specific area, a patch of woods where the trees grew too close and the sunlight barely broke through. I started my hike early in the morning, around sunrise. My gear wasn't anything fancy by today's standards, just a decent camera, a few lenses, and a sturdy backpack with some supplies. I followed a narrow trail that wasn't really a proper trail, more like a barely visible path animals had worn down over time. I noticed right away that something felt off. It wasn't like I heard a scream or saw anything jump out at me. It was the stillness, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've walked into someone else's secret. The air felt thicker, and I remember thinking it smelled kind of damp and earthy, more intense than usual. I brushed it off and kept going. After about an hour of pushing through dense underbrush, I came upon strange markings on the ground. They weren't footprints in the traditional sense, but more like huge, irregular impressions. Some were deeper than others, like something heavy had stepped there, and one looked a bit like a massive human-shaped foot, but too broad, too long. I squatted down, ran my fingers over the edge of one of these impressions, and realized the leaves were still pressed into the mud. This wasn't old. Whatever made it had passed by recently. I didn't feel afraid at that exact moment, more intrigued. I tried to take a photo, but the lighting was terrible, and the shape was not super clear. I decided to move a bit further, hoping to catch more evidence, maybe better prints or some claw marks on tree trunks, something that could help me identify what lived out there. As I moved deeper, I started hearing soft, distant noises. It was like a gentle crack of twigs, then silence, then a rustle of leaves far off to my right. It felt like something was pacing me. I'd stop, and after a pause, I'd hear another tiny shuffle. I tried to calm my breathing and really listen, but whatever it was stayed hidden, never fully revealing itself. The undergrowth was thick, and the branches were so low and twisted that you couldn't see more than a few yards ahead in some places. I kept going, mostly because I was stubborn. I'd come out there to get photos of rare animals, and I wasn't about to turn back just because I heard a few strange noises. But about an hour later, I found myself in a small ravine. The sides were damp, and the floor of that ravine was littered with old leaves and a few scattered bones. At first, I thought they were just animal bones, maybe deer remains left by coyotes or something like that. But I noticed some of them were cracked in half, like something had snapped them open to get at the marrow. At that point, I started feeling uneasy. I'd never seen bones broken like that in these woods. I backed up a bit and tried to find a way around the ravine. As I climbed a small slope covered in moss, I noticed deep scratches on a nearby trunk. They were high up, too high for a bear, at least that's what it seemed like to me, and the pattern was weirdly spaced, like large, powerful fingers had raked across the bark. I tried to steady my hand and snap a photo of the trunk. My heart was beating faster now. This was no deer or bobcat territory. This was something else. I kept hearing that subtle movement around me. At one point, I swear I felt eyes on me, like the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. I turned my head slowly, scanning the gloom. That's when I saw it, or at least a shape that shouldn't have been there. Between two thick oaks, maybe 30 feet away, I caught a glimpse of a figure. It was tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, and covered in something dark and rough. I couldn't tell if it was fur or just shadow. It stood perfectly still. I froze, barely breathing, just staring. I raised my camera, hands shaking, trying to focus, but before I could press the shutter, it moved. Not running, not charging, just a silent, fluid motion out of view. It was so quiet that I might have doubted I saw it if not for that lingering smell, a musty animal scent that reminded me of wet dog fur and decaying leaves. Whatever it wasn't just some local lore. It was real, and it was there with me. I wanted to call for help, but I was too far out, and back in '77 you didn't exactly have a radio or cell phone in your pocket. I tried to keep calm, telling myself not to panic. If it had wanted to hurt me, it probably could have by now. Maybe it was just curious too. Still, every instinct told me to get out of there. I started walking back the way I came, trying not to make noise. I kept my camera ready, just in case. Every now and then, I'd catch a hint of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. Just leaves and branches and the fading daylight. The hours felt longer than they should have as I retraced my steps, and the whole time I felt like I was being followed. Sometimes I heard a soft grunt or a faint breath. I can't explain it better than that. Just these low, almost human-sounding exhales, always a little too far to see but close enough to feel. By the time I finally reached a more familiar part of the forest, where the trees thinned out and I could make out distant farmland through the gaps, I felt drained. My shirt was soaked in sweat, and my hands were shaking. I half expected that thing, or another one just like it, to appear at the edge of my vision and come at me. But nothing happened. It just sort of faded away, like it had been part of the forest itself. When I got back to Somerville, I tried to tell a few people, just casually, about the weird tracks and the noises, kind of testing the waters. Most of them shrugged or smiled in that weird, knowing way, as if to say, "Yeah, we've heard stories, but we're not going to talk about it." A couple of folks rolled their eyes and suggested I'd been out there too long with my camera. One older guy just nodded like he wasn't surprised at all. I tried to show a photo of the scratch marks on the tree, but no one seemed very interested. They acted like it was normal, or maybe they just didn't want to get involved. Over the next few days, I developed the film, hoping the camera caught something definitive. But the lighting was bad, and everything came out grainy. The footprints looked like random depressions, and the scratch marks didn't look as dramatic on film as they did in person. And that tall shape between the trees? Nothing. Just a blur of shadow where I swear something stood. It was frustrating. It made me question myself. Did I just imagine it? But I know what I felt. The weight of its presence, the smell, the sound of it breathing. Even now, decades later, I still think about that day. I never had another encounter like it, never heard other people's stories directly, and I eventually moved away from Somerville. I still can't explain what I saw or what followed me out there. It didn't exactly attack me or try to scare me off in some dramatic way. It just made itself known and then vanished. I've read about similar encounters since. People talking about big, ape-like creatures deep in North American forests. You can call it what you want, but I'm certain I was near one of those creatures that afternoon. I guess I'll never really know what that thing was, why it showed up, or why it let me walk away untouched. I just know that day changed how I see places that seem empty and quiet. Sometimes there are things out there, living just beyond our sight, that we can't neatly label or explain. I've come to accept that I won't ever have a neat ending to that story. It just happened, and then it was over, leaving me with questions that still creep into my mind all these years later. Story 10. I still remember that day in the summer of 1983, back in Gentryville, Arkansas. I was a mechanic at a small garage off a quiet road, and I had just finished repairing an old truck that had given me hours of trouble. It was late afternoon, and after all that greasy, sweaty work, I decided to clear my head and take a short walk into the wooded trails behind the shop. I had done it a few times before, just wandering around to relax, but this time felt different from the start. I noticed it right after I stepped off the gravel and onto the narrow dirt path. Normally, you'd hear the birds calling out, insects buzzing, maybe a squirrel rustling through the leaves. But that day, it was as if the whole place was holding its breath. There were no clear signs at first, just a subtle drop in the usual forest sounds. Instead of the steady background chatter, I got only these odd, spaced-out chirps and distant cracks. It was enough to set me on edge, but I kept walking, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. As I moved deeper, the air felt heavier, like I'd walked into some strange bubble where time ran slower. I found myself trying to step quietly, as if I didn't want to announce my presence. I'm not sure why I did that. I never cared about making noise out there before, but something in my gut told me it was best to be careful. I started to feel like I wasn't alone, even though I couldn't see or hear anyone else. It was that prickly sensation you get when you just know someone's eyes are on you. I'd worked outdoors plenty of times and had grown up hunting small game around these parts. I knew the difference between hearing a deer pass by and feeling watched. This was definitely someone or something watching. I tried to calm myself down by checking my surroundings. The trees were mostly oaks and pines, and the ground was covered in last season's fallen leaves. Nothing special, nothing out of place at first glance. But as I kept looking around, I saw something odd. Several branches high up were snapped off, not fallen or dead, but twisted and broken. It was weird because these branches weren't the kind of thing a casual passerby could reach. They were too high, and it looked like they'd been deliberately snapped with some serious force. I paused to look closer, trying to figure out if a storm had done this, but we hadn't had any rough weather lately. My mind started to race. Maybe a big animal? A bear, I guessed, but black bears around here usually don't mess with tree branches like that. And who would climb that high just to snap them? As I circled around one of these trees, I saw something else. Strange marks in the soft ground. They weren't quite footprints, not like you'd see from a person, but they had a pattern that suggested toes. They were broader, flatter, and I couldn't make out a clear shape. But they looked like they belonged to something heavy. They weren't just at one spot either. I followed a few prints leading off into thicker brush. The leaves and undergrowth were disturbed, pressed down as if something large had passed through. Normally, I would have followed more closely, but my gut was telling me that I didn't want to know what was at the end of that trail. The silence was starting to get on my nerves. Every now and then, I'd hear a quick snap of a twig or a shuffle of leaves, but the source never showed itself. It was always just ahead of me, or just behind me, and I couldn't lock onto it. I tried standing still for a few minutes, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but no luck. I'd turn my head, glance between the trunks, and still see nothing but shadows and green leaves. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I felt my heart rate pick up, and sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the mild temperature. It was a strange fear, not like the kind you get when you're cornered, but more like I was intruding on something's domain. It felt like I was being studied. I remember thinking I'd never felt so vulnerable out there. I usually felt at ease in the woods, but that day I wanted to get back to the shop's parking lot as fast as possible. I tried to keep my cool and head back the way I came. That's when I spotted something large and dark moving behind a thick cluster of bushes. I didn't see it clearly, just a silhouette. It was big, much taller than me, moving smoothly. I caught maybe a half-second glance before it stepped behind a tree trunk, completely silent. My chest tightened, and I actually stopped breathing for a moment. That was no bear. Bears don't move like that. And it sure as hell wasn't a person from town. The shape was too broad, its outline too rough. At that point, every instinct told me to leave. I tried not to run, even though my legs were ready to bolt. I made my steps as quiet as I could, trying not to crunch leaves or snap twigs. The woods seemed determined to make noise, though, and every tiny sound I made felt deafening. I wondered if I could feel the thing's gaze through the back of my skull. I kept checking over my shoulder, catching nothing but stillness. Then came the smell, just a faint whiff in the breeze. It was musky, rotten, like old damp fur left too long in a dark place. It hit my nose and turned my stomach. I don't recall any animal around here smelling like that. It reminded me of when a deer carcass goes bad. But not exactly. It was more like a mix of wet dog and decaying vegetation. It was gone as quickly as it came, but it was enough to convince me that something was out there, and it was definitely not friendly. I moved faster but tried to stay controlled. The path felt longer than usual, and the woods kept giving me that uncanny sense of depth, like the trees were stretching out, making it harder to reach the edge. My heart thumped, and I remember my mouth going dry. I could taste my own fear, bitter and metallic. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the edge of the clearing. I saw the old fence post behind the shop's lot and my battered workbench outside the garage door. Relief washed over me, but even then I expected to hear heavy footsteps behind me or see that shape come crashing through the branches. It never did. I stepped onto the gravel, turned around, and the woods looked just like they always did, calm, unremarkable, green and brown. It was as if the entire experience never happened, but I knew it had. I stood there catching my breath, wiping sweat from my brow, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to tell someone, but what was I going to say? That I got spooked by some broken branches and strange footprints? That I saw a big, dark shape watching me from behind a tree? Folks around here would have laughed or said I must have been tired. Maybe they'd say it was just a bear or my imagination. So I kept my mouth shut. I went back into the shop, washed the grease and dirt off my hands, and tried to get my mind right. I worked the next few hours in a sort of daze, replaying every moment in my head. I considered going back the next day with a camera or some friends, but I just couldn't. Something told me not to mess with that place again. I'd never felt so powerless, so at odds with my own backyard. I can't explain what I encountered, and I don't have any concrete proof that it was something beyond a normal animal. But I know what I felt, and I know that feeling of being watched, stalked maybe, was real. I've read some things over the years since then. Other people talking about strange creatures in the woods, tall and hairy, known as Bigfoot or whatever name you give it. At the time, I knew next to nothing about that stuff. But looking back, it makes me wonder if that's what I bumped into that day. I still don't know, and I guess I never will. It never happened again, and I never found any evidence. But that single afternoon changed the way I look at these forests. I learned that even familiar land can hold secrets, and sometimes those secrets want nothing to do with you. I never told anyone in person, never shared it with folks around here, but I can't deny what I felt and what I saw. Even today, decades later, I remember every detail. The silence, the broken branches, that strange smell, and the shape that moved too smoothly through the trees. I still get chills thinking about it. It came and went without warning, left me hanging with no answers. And that's the part that lingers. I'll never really know what I encountered out there. It's just something that happened and then ended, leaving me with nothing but questions and a memory that refuses to fade. Story 11. I remember that day like it just happened. It was late in the afternoon, sometime in 1986, and I was working as a small-time private investigator in Millfield, Virginia. Nothing fancy, mostly checking on missing pets or seeing if someone was trespassing on old farmland. That day, I was out near this abandoned railroad depot. The place was quiet, overgrown, and felt like the kind of spot kids might dare each other to explore after dark. I wasn't expecting much. Maybe I'd find some footprints of a coyote or some broken fence boards. But what I found still sends chills through me. I stepped off the dirt road and walked into the woods, just a short distance from the depot. Right away, I noticed something was off. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, as if every animal in the area had decided to shut up all at once. The air felt weird, heavy, almost thick, and there was this faint metallic smell that I couldn't place. It reminded me a bit of old blood or rusty iron. I tried to keep calm. I even tried telling myself dumb little jokes in my head, anything to cut the tension, but it just got worse with every step. As I moved closer to the depot, I spotted strange footprints on the wet ground. They were huge, way bigger than any humans, with what looked like toes but spaced all wrong. They weren't bear tracks either. I know what those looked like. These were different, like something with a wide, heavy foot had passed through. My gut twisted, and a little voice in my head said, "Leave." But I kept going anyway. Maybe I was curious, or maybe I just didn't want to admit I was scared. I tried to keep a steady pace, my boots crunching softly on damp leaves, That's when I realized I was being watched. I can't explain how I knew. There was no clear sign, no movement I could pinpoint, but I felt eyes on me. My neck prickled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. At one point, I heard a branch snap off to my left. I turned fast, but I saw nothing, just a flash of something dark disappearing behind the trees. It moved quickly and quietly for something that seemed so large. I caught a whiff of that metallic smell again, only stronger this time. My heart started pounding. I thought about heading into the depot building for cover, but then I imagined getting trapped inside. The idea of being stuck there, unable to see it coming, made my stomach turn. So I stayed outside, circling the structure, trying to keep enough distance so I could still run if I needed to. The old depot looked eerie in that strange light, half-rotten boards and broken windows, like it was watching me too. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated in my chest, and I knew it wasn't any animal I was familiar with. It sounded deliberate, almost like a warning. I froze, scanning the tree line, trying not to panic. My mouth went dry. Another snap of a branch, closer this time. I forced my feet to move, slow and steady, away from the depot and back toward where I thought the road was. My hands were shaking. I kept expecting to see something bursting through the trees, something impossible. A few steps later, I spotted it between the trunks. Tall, easily over 7 feet, covered in dark hair. Not like a bear's coat, more like an uneven, long covering of fur. And it was standing upright. I only glimpsed it for a second, but it was enough to send pure fear through me. Its shoulders were broad, and it moved with a kind of cautious strength, stepping sideways behind a cluster of pines. I couldn't make out the face in detail, but I felt its intelligence, its awareness. This wasn't just a dumb creature. I tried not to run. I'd always heard running triggers predators, and I sure as hell didn't want to trigger whatever this was. My mind raced. Was it some kind of escaped zoo animal? A weird local legend come to life? I felt ridiculous even thinking that, but there it was, right in front of me. I knew one thing: I didn't belong there. I changed direction slightly, trying to head back toward the dirt road. Each step felt like a gamble. I heard it behind me again, following at a distance. It never charged, never came right at me, but it kept itself close enough that I knew I wasn't alone. Now and then, it made these deep, grunting sounds, not quite like a gorilla, but not like anything else I can name. My chest tightened, and my thoughts were a mess. All I could think was that I needed to get out before darkness fell. The trees already felt darker, the light fading quicker than it should have. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the dirt road, I almost cried from relief. The moment I stepped into that open space, I turned around. I couldn't see it anymore. It stayed hidden, just inside the woods, blending in with the shadows. For a minute I stood there, panting, staring at the spot where I knew it was. Nothing moved. It was like it melted away into the forest. I backed off slowly, then walked briskly down the road to my truck. Once inside, I locked the doors. Like that would help if it decided to come after me. I sat there shaking, trying to make sense of what just happened. I eventually drove off, my head spinning with questions. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who'd believe me? It sounded like a joke, a local myth. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt out there. Over the years, I've looked back on that day so many times. I still don't have any answers. Maybe there are things out there, deep in the woods, that we're not meant to understand. Maybe it was just one strange creature passing through. All I know is that I felt hunted by something powerful and smart, something that didn't want me in its territory. It let me go, and I'm grateful for that. But I'll never forget how that air felt thick, how the silence pressed down on me, how my heart nearly exploded in my chest. Even today I can't explain it. It's just one of those things that happened and then stopped, leaving me with nothing but fear and questions. If you've never felt that kind of presence, never had your instincts scream at you to leave, it's hard to understand. But trust me, I was there, and I'll never be the same after it. Story 12. I remember that night in 1987 like it just happened yesterday. I was working the night shift as a security guard at that old railway bridge near Hawthorne Creek, Minnesota. The job was usually boring and quiet, just me, my flashlight, and the hum of distant freight trains. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, and that's exactly why I got the job. But on that particular evening, something was off from the start. It was late afternoon when I clocked in. The sun was dipping behind the thick pines, leaving long shadows across the old tracks. The bridge was an old iron structure, the kind that creaked and groaned under its own weight. Rust flaked off the beams, and the wooden ties beneath them always had that damp, musty smell. It wasn't a place anyone would hang out voluntarily, especially after dark. I'd done this job for a few months and never had any reason to feel uneasy. But that day, right as the light began to fade, I started hearing sounds underneath the bridge. It was subtle at first, like something scraping against the old supports or rummaging through the brush near the riverbank. Normally, I'd chalk it up to a raccoon or a stray deer, but this was different. It had a weird cadence, like a two-part shuffle followed by a heavy thump, as if whatever was down there was big, and it didn't care about keeping quiet. I tried to ignore it. I tried to think of excuses. Maybe it was just the current shifting debris, or a large fish flopping around in a shallow part of the river. But the noises weren't coming from the water. They were definitely coming from under the bridge's structure, where the iron beams met the dense undergrowth. I remember gripping my flashlight a bit tighter. There wasn't any cell signal out there, not in that remote corner where even the trees looked older and more twisted than they should be. If something went wrong, I was on my own. I tried to calm myself down by thinking about silly things, dumb jokes I'd heard at the diner that morning, the look on my neighbor's face when I mowed my lawn at sunrise last week, anything to break that tension. But it didn't help much. My heart was still pounding. The noise got louder after the sun finally dipped beneath the horizon. The twilight made everything look strange, the outline of the bridge, the dark silhouette of the trees, the black surface of the water beneath. I walked slowly across the bridge, shining my flashlight down between the gaps in the rails and the beams, trying to see something, anything, moving below. All I could make out were shapes of tangled branches and brush. But I swear I saw movement. Something large shifting behind a cluster of ferns, maybe. It wasn't just a raccoon. It wasn't something small. And the smell. There was a smell I hadn't noticed before. It was musky, kind of like wet fur and damp earth, but stronger than anything I'd ever smelled out there. I tried leaning over the railing on one side, aiming my flashlight down at a steep angle. The beam caught some of the rusted iron and part of the riverbank, but nothing else. I could still hear the noise, though. It sounded like this slow, deliberate pacing, and once or twice I could have sworn I heard a low grunt. Not a growl exactly, but a deep huffing sound that rattled my nerves. My breathing got faster. I thought about climbing down there, but that was out of the question. No way was I heading down those slippery slopes, through that thick brush, in the pitch dark, not after hearing that. A few hours crawled by with me pacing the length of the bridge, trying to pinpoint the source of the sounds. The worst part was that the noises would fade out for a while, then come back suddenly, closer than before. At one point, I felt like it was directly under my feet, right beneath the middle of the bridge. I knelt down carefully, placed my ear against one of the old wooden beams, and listened. That's when I heard a distinct, heavy breathing. It was like the breathing of a large animal, slow and forceful, with a slight rasp. My stomach dropped. This thing was not just passing through. It seemed to be hanging around, watching, waiting. For what? I had no idea. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a black bear had wandered down into the creek bed. They weren't super common in that exact area, but it wasn't impossible. Still, bears usually sniff around and move on. They don't lurk silently under bridges. And the smell was different too, stronger, earthier, more unsettling. There was also a strange feeling in the air. It's hard to explain, but I felt like I was being observed. I know how that sounds, but I swear, I felt eyes on me. Every time I moved, it moved. Every time I tried to get a better look, it stayed just out of my flashlight's reach. At one point, my flashlight caught a glimpse of something. It was just for a split second. A shape between the leaves, a dark, hulking figure that disappeared the moment the light hit it. It was tall, broader than any person I'd ever seen, and covered in something that looked like hair. I'm aware of how that sounds. Back then, I never really believed in those stories people told about Bigfoot. But that night, my belief system got shaken up real bad. As the night dragged on, the thing got bolder. I started hearing it move along the bank, up and down, occasionally rustling branches and breaking twigs. One branch snapped so loudly it made me jump back, nearly dropping my flashlight. I stood there, heart pounding, mouth dry, not sure what to do next. If I yelled, would it scare it away or provoke it? If I stayed silent, would it come closer? I just stayed still and listened. Hours went by like that, me on top of the bridge, it underneath, both of us doing this strange dance. The wind had died down completely, and there was a heavy stillness in the air. No distant traffic, no animal calls, nothing. Just that steady breathing and occasional movement under the bridge. I kept checking my watch, counting down the hours until the faintest hint of sunrise. Eventually, as the sky started to pale, the sounds became less frequent. I couldn't hear the breathing anymore, but I was too terrified to assume it was gone. I waited, flashlight in hand, scanning the tree line. Slowly, as the light grew, I could see more detail. The brush below the bridge had been disturbed. Branches bent, ground churned up, leaves scattered. It looked like something big had paced back and forth all night long. But now, in the first light of morning, I couldn't see anything moving. Whatever it was, it had slipped away. I stayed up there until I was absolutely sure the sun was high enough to see clearly. When I finally descended to check things out, I felt an uneasy relief. The area beneath the bridge was quiet, just the sound of water trickling and birds starting their morning chatter. But the ground told a different story. Some of the ferns were flattened. There were deep impressions in the softer earth that looked like footprints, but not any prints I'd ever seen. They were large, with a vague shape that suggested toes, but not like a human or a bear. I got a chill just looking at them. I know what people would say if I told them. They'd laugh, say it was a bear, or that I was tired and imagining things. That's why I kept it to myself for a long time. But I can still remember the smell, that heavy musk. I can still remember the sound of it breathing under the planks, pacing back and forth in the darkness. And I remember how completely helpless I felt, with no one to call, no backup, just my flashlight and that old bridge. Part of me still wonders if I should have gone down there and tried to get a better look, but I'm not sure I would have made it back if I had. To this day, I have no explanation. After that night, everything went back to normal. I worked a few more months at that same job, never heard those sounds again, never caught a glimpse of anything else out of the ordinary. But I can't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me, something that didn't belong in the realm of normal wildlife. I've heard stories around town, vague mentions of strange sightings over the years, but no one ever has proof, just rumors, just uneasy memories like mine. I've learned to accept that I may never know what it was. Maybe that's for the best. Some things out there remain hidden for a reason. I try not to obsess over it, but every now and then, especially when I'm alone at night, I think back to that evening in 1987. I can still feel the weight of the darkness under that old railway bridge and the unsettling knowledge that I wasn't alone. Story 13. I remember that day so vividly, even though it's been decades. It was back in the fall of 1988, when I was living in Clearbrook, Idaho. I worked as a historian and researcher, mostly stuck in dusty rooms, poring over old documents, piecing together bits of local history that nobody else seemed to care about. I was used to digging through old archives and forgotten records, trying to find threads of stories that had slipped through the cracks of time. But on that particular day, I stepped away from my desk and followed a lead out into the thick trees beyond the old farms at the edge of town. I never really told anyone the full story of what happened out there, not in detail. Whenever I brought it up, I got these skeptical glances or awkward smiles, so I mostly let it go. But it still haunts me, and I guess I just need to get it off my chest. Clearbrook was quiet, almost too quiet, especially if you drifted far enough from the main roads. That day, I drove out in my old pickup, following an old hand-drawn map I'd found tucked away in the town's tiny historical society office. It led me to a spot I'd never bothered to check before, an abandoned barn about 20 minutes outside of town. The building itself had shown up on old survey maps dating back to the early 1900s, but there were hardly any records about who built it or why it had been left to rot. I was intrigued, but honestly, I just thought I'd find some collapsed beams, maybe some rusted farm equipment, snap a few photos and go home. I packed a flashlight, a notebook, a cheap camera with only a few shots left in the roll, and wore my sturdy boots. It felt like a normal day's work. On the drive out, the road turned from asphalt to dirt, and after a while, the fields gave way to this dense patch of forest. Back then, Clearbrook wasn't exactly bustling with tourists, and this was the kind of area few people bothered to wander into. As I got closer to where I believed the barn should be, something felt off. I can't explain it well, but the air just felt heavier. There were hardly any sounds, no birds calling, no squirrels rustling in the brush, nothing. Normally, even on the quietest days, you'd hear at least a couple of woodpeckers or see a deer darting off. Here, it was like everything had cleared out. I parked the truck at the side of a dirt clearing and started walking, compass in hand, following a faint, overgrown trail. After about 10 minutes of trudging through tall grass and brambles, I spotted the barn's roofline poking through some trees. The building looked in worse shape than I expected. The roof sagged inward, and one side of the structure had partly collapsed. The wood was weathered grey, some boards missing, large gaps where I could see dim light from the other side. The place should have just felt like any old abandoned building, but I couldn't shake that feeling that something was off. My heart was thumping a little harder than normal, and my mouth felt dry. As I approached, I noticed the silence again. I've been in quiet woods, but this was different. It made me feel exposed, like something was watching me. The wind rustled the branches overhead, and that was about the only movement. The barn door was half fallen off, leaning at a weird angle. I considered going inside, but something told me I shouldn't. Instead, I started circling the exterior. That's when I noticed these marks scratched into the wooden beams that still stood upright. They were long, uneven gouges, too big and too high up to be from a raccoon or a stray dog. They looked like something had raked massive claws across the boards. I actually touched one of the grooves with my fingertip. The edges were rough and splintered, and the scratch was deep enough that I couldn't imagine it was made by any local animal I knew about. A bear, maybe? But the spacing was odd, and they ran vertically down the barn's side at a height that made no sense. I tried to stay calm. I thought about making some stupid joke to myself, something to ease the tension, but I barely managed a dry chuckle. I felt like every second I spent there, something was closing in. It was a weird paranoia. I listened carefully, but all I heard was the wind rattling some loose boards. The ground around the barn was littered with old dead leaves and some scattered stones. I noticed a smell too, like damp earth mixed with a sort of musky odor I couldn't identify. It reminded me of standing too close to a wild animal pen at a rundown zoo. It was faint, but it was there. Then I saw something else. Footprints. Not neat ones like a boot print, but large pressed-down patches where the grass had bent and the soil had been pushed aside. The impressions were broad, almost human-like, but bigger and with a strange shape. It wasn't a clear footprint like you'd see on a muddy bank, but enough to make me think some heavy thing had stood there or passed by recently. I crouched down and tried to gauge the size. It must have been at least a few inches longer than my own foot, and I wear a size 11. I got this chill that ran up my back. I straightened up and looked around, trying to see if anyone else was out there, maybe playing some prank on me. But there was no one, just trees and silence. I started hearing these subtle noises, like twigs snapping somewhere deeper in the woods. I'd whip my head around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it always sounded distant. I thought about calling out, asking if anyone was there, but something told me to keep quiet. I realized how alone I was, how far I'd strayed from any road. If something were to happen to me out there, I had no radio, no phone service. Not that cell phones were common or reliable back then, and nobody knew exactly where I was. I took a few steps away from the barn and scanned the tree line. That's when I felt a weight of eyes on me. It's a hard feeling to describe, like when you just know someone's staring at you from across a room. I looked in the direction of a thick cluster of pines, and that's when I glimpsed something dark and large move behind a trunk. It was quick, like a silhouette pulling back. I tried to rationalize it. Probably a bear or a moose, but it didn't move like one. It was upright. It was tall. I stood there, heart pounding, eyes locked on that spot, waiting to see something more. For a good minute, nothing happened. The wind picked up a bit. The boards of the barn creaked. My mouth felt even drier, and I realized I was breathing through my nose, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Then I heard a low, guttural sound, almost like a grunt or a huff, coming from that same direction. I thought I saw something step between the trees, just a hint of a shape taller than a man, broader across the shoulders, covered in something dark. The light was poor, everything felt shaded and dim, and I couldn't make out details. But I know I saw something. I backed up slowly, not daring to take my eyes off that spot. If it was an animal, I didn't want to provoke it. The thing is, I've seen bears, I've seen elk, and nothing about this shape matched them. It seemed too upright, too controlled in its movements. My chest was tight, and my brain was racing. It crossed my mind to take a picture, but I was terrified that any sudden movement might set it off. I kept moving back until I reached the side of the barn again. I stepped on a loose piece of wood, and it snapped loudly under my weight. That's when I heard a sudden rustling of branches. I jerked my head up, and the figure was gone, but the trees were still shaking, as if something large had just pushed through them. I realized I had to get the hell out of there. I turned and walked as fast as I could without breaking into a run. Running felt like a bad idea, like it would trigger a chase. I kept my ears open, half expecting to hear heavy steps behind me. Every time a branch cracked in the forest, I tensed up. The daylight was still there, but it felt dimmer, like storm clouds rolling in, even though I don't recall the weather changing that much. I was too focused on getting back to the truck. When I reached the clearing, I practically jumped into my pickup. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly get the key into the ignition. I locked the doors, which felt silly. If that thing wanted in, a flimsy old door wouldn't stop it, and started the engine. I backed up, turned around, and drove off, glancing in the rearview mirror. I swear, just before I rounded a bend, I saw a tall, dark figure step briefly out from the tree line and then disappear again, like it was watching me leave. Back in town, I sat in my place with a beer and tried to make sense of it. I told a couple of colleagues a watered-down version, leaving out the huge shape and focusing on the strange marks. They looked at me like I was trying to stir up some old legend. Over the next few weeks, I tried to rationalize it. Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs for a moment? Maybe. Could the scratches have been from an old piece of farm equipment falling and scraping the wood? Possibly. But deep down, I didn't believe any of those explanations. The feeling I had out there, that sense that I wasn't supposed to be there, that something was telling me to leave, was too real. I never went back to that spot. I never found out who built that barn or why it had been abandoned. There were no reports of missing people around that time, no stories in the local paper. Clearbrook went on like it always did. But I knew what I felt. I knew what I saw. Even today, I can't fully explain it. I'm not the kind of guy who jumps to wild conclusions. I've always tried to be grounded, to trust what I can verify. But this is one thing I can't shake, even after all these years. Sometimes late at night I think about that shape moving behind the trees, those strange marks on the barn, and that silence that pressed in on me like a warning. It never happened again, and I never heard similar accounts from anyone else, at least not in detail. I'm left with this memory that doesn't fit neatly into any box. I guess there are just some things we bump into out there, in the quiet corners of the world, that we'll never understand. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Story 14. I still remember that day back in 1989, out in Pinewood, Colorado, like it was yesterday. It was a late afternoon, early fall, I think. The sun hadn't fully dipped behind the mountains yet, but the light was getting that golden tint it has before it fades. I'd set out for my usual daily walk through the mountain trails near my place, something I'd done 100 times before without any trouble. I knew those paths well enough, knew what kind of wildlife might be around, which way the wind usually blew, and the general feel of the forest. But that day, it felt different, and not in any normal way. From the moment I stepped off the main trail and onto a smaller, less-traveled path, something was off. Normally, you'd hear birds, maybe a squirrel chattering, the distant rustle of something moving in the bushes. But it was dead silent. Not a single chirp, not a single rustle. It was so quiet that my own breathing seemed louder than normal, and every time I took a step, it felt like an intrusion in that weird, heavy silence. It's hard to put into words, but it was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried shaking it off. I even tried to keep my own mood light, thinking of dumb jokes or memories to keep my nerves from getting the best of me. But the feeling stayed. It was as if something was watching me, though I couldn't see anything. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to catch a glimpse of a deer or maybe a bear, but nothing. Just trees and undergrowth. It didn't make sense. I wasn't exactly scared at first, just uneasy. As I walked further along that narrow trail, I noticed the ground seemed oddly disturbed. I remember kneeling down at one point because I saw these impressions in the soil. Footprints, maybe, but not like any I'd seen before. I've been around bears. I know their tracks. And these weren't bears. These were bigger, spaced farther apart, and deeper. It looked like something heavy had stepped through, something walking on two legs. I'm not a tracker or anything, but I've got common sense, and those prints just weren't normal. I remember running my finger along the edge of one print. It was wide, not like a shoe, and the ground seemed almost compressed, like whatever made it had serious weight behind it. My gut started twisting at that point. The uneasy feeling turned into a low-level panic. I couldn't help but feel that whatever left those prints might still be around. The forest remained quiet. I couldn't even hear the distant hum of insects. Just silence and that weird sense of being watched. I stood up, brushed the dirt off my jeans, and decided it would be wise to turn back. There was no reason to keep pushing further into that silence. As I began retracing my steps, I swear I felt a sort of vibration through the ground. Nothing big, not like an earthquake, just a subtle tremor every once in a while. It could have been my imagination, but it felt real at the time. Like something large was moving behind the tree line, pacing me, staying just out of sight. I kept looking back, expecting to see a large silhouette darting behind a trunk or stepping into a shadow, but I never caught anything directly. Just that thick, suffocating quiet. I walked faster, trying to keep calm. Without any phone signal out there in '89, hell, I didn't even have a cell phone. There was no calling for help. I was on my own. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The weirdest part was that I didn't see broken branches or any obvious signs that something huge was stalking me. But that feeling, it's not something I can easily explain. It's like having eyes on the back of your head, knowing there's a presence just beyond your field of vision. At one point, I thought I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Maybe 30, 40 feet away, through a cluster of thick pines, I saw something dark and upright shift its weight and then disappear. It was tall, at least taller than a man. No sound, though, just that silent movement. I froze, my legs suddenly feeling weak. I waited a moment, staring at the spot, trying to see it again. Nothing, but now I was shaking inside. Whatever it was too quiet and too cautious to be a regular animal just passing by. I forced myself to keep moving, trying to act like I hadn't seen anything. The last thing I wanted was to look like prey. I walked with what I hoped looked like confidence, even though I felt like running. Every so often, I heard a soft rustle, very soft, like something testing the ground. I remember smelling this strange, musky odor at one point. It wasn't a skunk. It was more like a damp animal smell mixed with earth and sweat. It only lasted for a few seconds, then it was gone. I stayed alert, scanning the trees, the underbrush, every trunk and fallen branch. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, and that was the worst part, this complete uncertainty. My mind was racing. Could it be a bear with some weird footprints? Could it be a person messing with me? But people don't leave footprints like that, and a bear would have grunted, huffed, or done something bear-like. And that figure I thought I saw, bears don't move that way. They don't stand around like that. I'd seen enough nature shows and lived here long enough to know the difference. The closer I got back to the more familiar part of the trail, the more I felt that presence fade. The silence started to crack a bit. I could hear a distant bird again, the faint trickle of a small stream. It felt like stepping out of a weird bubble of tension into normality. I still hurried, though, and didn't stop until I reached my own property line. Once I was home, I stayed on my porch for a while, staring at the tree line as the last bit of daylight disappeared. I kept expecting something to follow me out, to show itself in the open. But nothing did. I remember feeling that tightness in my chest gradually ease off, but my mind kept replaying the silent forest, the strange footprints, that quick glimpse of a tall, dark shape, and the faint, musky smell. Later that evening, after I got inside and locked the door, I mentioned the whole thing to a buddy of mine who lived nearby. I tried to describe the prints and the silence. He gave me this strange little smile, like he knew something he wouldn't say out loud, and just said something like, "Yeah, a few folks have felt uneasy up that way." That was it. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. At the time, I guess I didn't want to sound crazy by asking if he believed in Bigfoot or some wild creature in the woods. To this day, I can't prove what I saw or felt. It's not like I took photos or collected evidence. The whole thing left me with this lingering sense of not being alone out there, even when I couldn't see anyone or anything. I've gone hiking since then, of course, and I still love those woods, but I never forgot that strange day. Sometimes I wonder if I crossed paths with something that's not supposed to exist, or at least not supposed to be out in the open where guys like me might notice it. Maybe it was just a trick of my mind, but I can't ignore those footprints, that silence, that feeling of being watched. Nothing like that ever happened to me again. But I remember it clearly, and when I think about it, I still get this uneasy, creeping feeling. It's something I can't explain, and it just kind of hangs in the back of my mind, a reminder that there are things out there we can't quite name or understand. Sometimes I wish I could go back and figure out what the hell it was. But honestly, I'm probably better off letting it remain a mystery. It came and went, like a strange ripple in an otherwise normal life, and I have no choice but to accept that. Story 15. It was back in the summer of 1990, and I remember that night more vividly than I'd like. I was working as a security guard in this old, run-down warehouse on the outskirts of Grayfield, Washington. The place had probably been built decades before, long abandoned by whoever once cared about it. My job was straightforward: walk through the dim corridors, check the rusty machinery, make sure no one was messing around inside. It was quiet work, usually mind-numbingly so. I never imagined I'd be sharing what I'm about to say, but the memory hasn't left me. That night, I started my shift around midnight. The sky outside was overcast, so not even moonlight came through the grimy windows. The building's interior was mostly lit by my flashlight. I remember the smell, a mix of old grease, dust, and mildew. I'd been working there for a while, so I knew that smell well, but something about it felt off that night. It was heavier. It felt like the air itself was thicker, almost humid, though there was no reason for it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the whole place was holding its breath. I began my usual patrol, walking through the narrow halls formed by stacks of crates and old machinery parts. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. Normally, that echo comforted me, just a sign that I was alone. But this time, it felt like the echo was lagging behind in a weird way, as if waiting to see what I'd do next. I tried to ignore it, but my nerves were on edge. It's hard to describe, but I felt watched. It was like when you know someone's behind you, even if you don't see them. My skin started to crawl, and I couldn't pinpoint why. A few minutes later, I noticed that some of the equipment looked out of place. A few pipes I was sure had been stacked on one side of the corridor earlier in the week were now scattered. A large sheet of metal that had always leaned against the eastern wall was now flat on the ground. Maybe some animal got in, I thought. Raccoons were common around there, sometimes even stray dogs. But as I continued, it became clear that whatever moved those things was big, really big. The footprints on the dusty floor weren't shaped like boots, and they weren't from any dog. They were huge, somewhat broad, and not quite human. I crouched down, running my hand over one print, feeling how deep it was. Something heavy had passed through. My heart started pounding. I remember thinking, do I call someone? Who the hell would I call? There was no phone signal in that old place. Cell coverage out there was basically non-existent, and we didn't have a landline in the warehouse. The nearest building was too far away to shout for help. I had a flashlight and a wooden baton. Not exactly reassuring, considering I had no idea what I was dealing with. Still, I tried to stay calm. I decided I'd cut the patrol short. I had no reason to hang around playing hero. If some massive animal had gotten in, my best move would be to get out and let someone more qualified handle it in the morning. I turned toward the exit, walking faster than I normally would. That's when I heard this low grunt, or maybe a growl. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, resonant, like it came from something with a massive chest. Every hair on my body stood up. I swept the flashlight around but saw nothing. The beam just cut through stale air and dust. Yet I could feel its presence. It was close. As I tried to move forward, something ahead shifted in the darkness. I heard a scraping sound, metal against concrete, like something big brushing against the old machinery. Then a shape passed between two stacks of crates, tall enough that it had to hunch over, not to hit the overhead beams. I only caught a glimpse of it, and the flashlight's beam flickered at the worst possible time. But I saw dark, matted hair and a broad, powerful silhouette. Not a bear. We had bears in the region, and I knew what they looked like. This was different. Its limbs looked too long, its gait too deliberate. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I froze, thinking maybe it didn't notice me, but the reality was it knew exactly where I was. There was a new smell in the air, musky, earthy and rank, like wet fur and rotting leaves. My breathing got shallow, and I realized I was shaking. I tried to step backward slowly, careful not to make noise, but the old floor betrayed me. A loose piece of debris shifted, and the crack of it felt like a gunshot in that silence. I heard another grunt, then heavy thuds as something large moved closer. At this point, I didn't care about protocol or pride. I broke into a half-run, trying to keep the flashlight steady enough to avoid tripping over junk lying around. As I turned a corner, my beam caught a brief look at it. Just for a second. I wish I'd never seen it. It was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair covering most of its body except around the face. The eyes reflected the light back at me, not like an animal's eyeshine, but more like a dim, intelligent glare. I couldn't make out all the details, but I saw enough to know it wasn't something I should be there with. Its arms hung low, and when it moved, it did so smoothly, like it was in full control. This was no dumb beast. It was something else, something that knew I was intruding. I nearly stumbled as I made it to the main corridor leading to the exit. Behind me, I heard metal clanging, as if it were casually tossing aside heavy pieces of scrap that would take 2 or 3 men to move. I felt like a rabbit being watched by a predator that was just toying with it. The door was ahead, just a few more steps. I could see a faint glow where the outside security light hit the gravel yard. My fingers were slick with sweat, fumbling for the door handle. Finally, I got it open and practically fell outside. Out in the open air, I expected to feel safe, but the night was eerily quiet, as if the surrounding fields and forests were holding their own vigil. I turned back to the warehouse and saw nothing following me out. Not a sound, not a silhouette, not even those strange footprints. Just the empty darkness inside. That's what got me. This thing, whatever it was, didn't need to chase me. It knew the territory, and it knew I wasn't going to be a threat. It could vanish whenever it wanted. I stood there for a good long while, catching my breath, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I wanted to tell someone, but who would believe me? Later that night, I tried mentioning it to a co-worker the next evening, and he just gave me this look, like I was trying to pull a prank. Without proof, I knew I'd get nowhere. But I'm telling you, I know what I saw. It wasn't just a shadow or my imagination. It was there, large as life, inside that dusty old building. I never saw anything like that again. The following days were uneventful. Everything was in its normal place again by the time the day shift arrived, as if nothing had happened. No strange footprints, no sounds, no rearranged debris. Just the same old warehouse, quiet and dull. But I never shook off that feeling. I still remember the thickness in the air, the deep grunt, those huge footprints, and those eyes. It felt like they looked right through me. Even now, decades later, I don't have a neat explanation. I know there are stories about creatures in the Pacific Northwest, things people dismiss as legends or hoaxes. I don't blame them. I would have scoffed too if I hadn't been there. But something was in that warehouse with me. Something that wasn't supposed to be real. I got out of there that night, and I'm grateful for that. But the memory has stayed with me, reminding me that the world's a bigger, stranger place than we like to admit. And sometimes it steps out of the darkness, gives you a look, and then slips away without leaving a trace. I still can't explain it. I doubt I ever will. Story 16. I remember it was early fall of 1991, back when I was working as a mechanic in a small place called Rosedale, here in Wyoming. I had spent the entire day hunched over truck transmissions, my arms and shoulders stiff, my head buzzing from engine noise. By the time I finally wrapped up, I felt like I needed some air, something to clear my mind and shake off that greasy workshop smell. There was this little trail not too far from where I lived, barely mentioned in any guidebooks, just a quiet stretch of forest that most people ignored. I figured a walk would calm me down before the sun dipped low. I headed out that late afternoon, boots crunching on the needles of pine trees, the air surprisingly still. The whole area was mostly tall pines, a soft, mossy floor, and just enough light slipping through the branches to make me feel relaxed. I remember the distant sound of running water, a small creek I'd passed a few times before. Nothing special, just peaceful background noise. I walked deeper along the trail, trying to unwind, maybe think about what I'd do for dinner. But something felt off pretty quickly, and I'm still not sure why I noticed it at first. It was just this sudden hush, like someone turned the volume knob down on the whole forest. No birds, no squirrels, not even the hum of insects. The quiet felt unnatural. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a hawk flew by or a coyote was nearby, causing the smaller critters to go silent. That happens, right? Still, my neck felt tight and my stomach got weirdly knotted. I even mumbled a few dumb jokes to myself, just some nonsense to break the tension. But the unease wouldn't go away. It was like every step I took put me deeper into some strange pocket of silence. I've been outdoors a lot in my life, and I know forests can get quiet. But this was different. It was like something was watching and waiting, making sure I knew it was there without showing itself. As I kept moving, I noticed these marks on a nearby tree trunk, long, deep scratches. They looked fresh, the bark peeled back in thick strips. I've seen bear marks before, and this didn't match. These were too wide, too spread out. They didn't look like claw marks from a mountain lion either. I ran my fingers along them, and I could still feel bits of bark dust where it had been torn off recently. Whatever made those marks was strong and tall enough to reach well above my eye level. I'm not a short guy, and these were definitely higher than I could scratch without stretching. I stood there staring at those marks, and that's when my body really started screaming at me to leave. My heart was drumming in my ears. I can't say exactly why I was so scared, but I was. That uneasy silence only got heavier. Without even thinking, I spun around, expecting to see something behind me. Nothing, just trees and soft moss. But I had the undeniable feeling I was being watched. I felt eyes on me, as if I'd intruded on something's territory. I decided I wasn't going to push my luck. The day was getting late, and I had no intention of stumbling around in the dark out there, not when I was this rattled. I turned back the way I came, trying to keep a normal pace and not break into a run. I've read that running triggers predators, makes you look like prey. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, not constantly, but every few steps. Still nothing, just the same stillness, the same oppressive quiet. Halfway back, I thought I heard a sound, a low, heavy grunt, maybe 20 yards behind me. My skin went cold. It didn't sound like a bear's huff or a deer snort. It was deeper, more resonant, like something big forcing air through its chest. I whipped around and again saw nothing but trees. I couldn't pinpoint a source, and that unsettled me more than anything. My mind started racing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just the wind or a tree creaking. but there was no wind. The air felt dead still. I tried to pick up my pace without breaking into a run, my boots snapping twigs I hadn't noticed before. Each snap made my heart jump. I just wanted to get out of that section of the woods, back to where the path widened and I could see further ahead. I kept imagining what kind of thing could make those scratches, could follow me without me seeing it, and could keep so silent. Once or twice I thought I caught a faint scent in the air, something musky and damp, not like wet dog, but something heavier and more unpleasant. It was faint, gone as soon as I tried to focus on it. I finally got to a part of the trail that opened up slightly, where the pines weren't so dense. A bit more light filtered in, and I felt a small wave of relief. Even though I still felt watched, at least I had more space around me. I paused to catch my breath and calm down, telling myself I was probably just being paranoid. Then I heard it again, a crunch of leaves behind me, as if something stepped on them deliberately. I looked back fast, expecting to see a bear or a large animal. Nothing, but the feeling that something was just behind the tree line, hidden but right there, was overwhelming. I stood frozen for a moment, my breathing loud in my own ears, and I realized I was gripping my fists so tight my knuckles hurt. I wanted to call out, to say something like, "Who's there?" But my throat felt tight. Instinct told me that if I made noise, I might make things worse. So I just kept moving, keeping my eyes forward, trying not to panic. The forest remained silent. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps, and that occasional, almost too quiet sound of something large shifting its weight behind me. After what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes, I finally saw the familiar break in the trees that led back to where I'd parked. It wasn't far now. If I could just get out of those woods and back into my truck, I'd be fine. The entire time, I expected that at any second something would show itself, a massive figure rushing me from behind a tree. I kept mentally preparing for what I'd do if I saw something. Would I run? Would I freeze? My mind was a mess of fear and adrenaline, but nothing came. By the time I reached the edge of the trail, my shirt was damp with sweat and my mouth was dry. As I stepped onto more open ground, I noticed the silence started to lift a bit. Far off, I could hear a distant car engine, maybe a tractor, something normal. The oppressive weight on my chest eased a little. I turned around one last time, staring back into the tree line. I couldn't see anything, but my heart was still pounding. I had this weird sense that something stood just beyond the darkness, watching me leave. I never saw it. I never got a clear look at anything. I can't prove a damn thing. It could have been just my imagination, or a bear, or a mountain lion acting strange. But I've lived in these parts a good while, and I know the wildlife fairly well. Those scratch marks and that heavy grunt don't match anything I've encountered. And the way the forest went quiet, like every living thing was hiding. I still can't shake that feeling. I didn't tell anyone about it at the time. What would I say? I think I was stalked by something I never saw. People would laugh it off or think I was trying to pull their leg. There were no footprints I could point out, no fur caught on branches, and I sure as hell didn't have a camera. This was 1991. No cell phone service out there, no easy way to call for help, no internet to check for similar experiences. I just went home, locked my door, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. But I knew better. Even now, after all these years, I still think about it. Every time I remember that day, I get this tightening in my chest. I've walked in many forests since then, but I've never felt that same atmosphere. To this day, I have no explanation. It happened, it ended, and that's it. I can't say what was out there, and I doubt I ever will. But I know something was. Something big, smart enough to stay hidden, and curious enough to follow me without ever fully showing itself. I guess that's all I can say. It just stopped as suddenly as it started. One moment I felt hunted, The next, I was back on familiar ground, and the weight of that presence lifted. I have no proof, no neat conclusion. It's just something that happened, something I can't forget, and something I'll probably never understand. Story 17. Back in 1992, I was working as a private investigator in a small place called Wyndham Lakes, Nevada. If you don't know it, it's basically a quiet little village stuck in a wide, dusty landscape. Everyone there mostly minded their own business. The work was usually boring, cheating spouses, disputes over land, but it paid the bills. On this particular night, I had headed out into the outskirts, near some strange rock formations, chasing a lead that, to be honest, I didn't think would amount to much. I just remember that it was late, the sky was unbelievably clear and full of stars, and I had no cell signal whatsoever. It was just me, my old flashlight, and the crunching sound of my boots on the sandy ground. As I moved deeper into that silent stretch of desert, something felt off. The wind usually rolled smoothly over the landscape, but now I swear it sounded like it was bending around something solid that I couldn't see. It's hard to explain, but it was like the wind's hum got interrupted by something big blocking its path. Yet there was nothing there. I tried to shrug it off as just my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt watched, the way you might in a dark room when you're convinced someone's behind you. My heart rate picked up, even though I tried telling myself I was being silly. I kept walking, checking the dirt for footprints, expecting maybe some sign of the guy I was supposed to find evidence on. Instead, I noticed something else. Rocks on the ground that seemed arranged in a weird pattern, not like a perfect circle or anything neat, but just oddly positioned, as if someone or something had just moved them. I leaned in, shining my flashlight closely. It wasn't the kind of thing that happens naturally. I could see shallow marks like these stones had been dragged or plucked from their natural resting place. I knew I hadn't done that, and I hadn't seen anyone else around. I stood up and glanced around again. I couldn't see any shape or figure, just a bunch of jagged rocks and empty space. But then I heard a noise, deep and low, like a heavy branch snapping or maybe thick bones popping. It cut through the silence and made my stomach twist. I spun my flashlight toward the direction of the sound, expecting maybe a large animal, maybe a coyote, or something else common around here. But I saw nothing, just darkness and more rocks in the distance. I started feeling seriously nervous. I didn't want to admit it, but my mind jumped to those stories people whisper about. Strange sightings, wild, hairy creatures that are rumored to wander these remote areas. Back then, I'd laugh at those stories, but now, with that weird wind, those moved stones, and that unsettling noise, I wasn't laughing. I could practically feel eyes on me, heavy, intense, and not the kind of eyes that belonged to a passing stranger, just curious about what I was doing. It felt more primal, like something sizing me up, deciding what to do next. I took a step back, and as I did, I could have sworn I saw something shift in my peripheral vision. I jerked my head toward it, and I still saw nothing concrete, just a vague blur against the rock formations. Was something crouched low, blending in with the terrain? My flashlight beam didn't help much. It just lit up dust and rock, and maybe a hint of a shape that vanished the moment I focused on it. The tension was almost unbearable. My chest was tight, and my mouth was suddenly dry. I had never felt fear like that in my entire career. The smartest move I could think of was to back away, keep my eyes open, and move toward a more open area. I didn't want to turn my back on it, so I walked backward at first, scanning every inch of the darkness. After a few steps, I risked turning around and walking a bit faster. The sound of my own heartbeat was loud in my ears. Every nerve in my body told me to get the hell out of there. There was no phone signal, no backup, no one around for miles. If something came at me, I'd be alone with it. As I moved toward a wider, more open stretch where there were fewer rock formations, the feeling eased just a little. The wind started to sound normal again, flowing freely, and that sensation of being closely watched began to fade. Still, I was rattled. I kept expecting to hear heavy footsteps behind me, something rustling or grunting, but after a while it was just me and the quiet desert. I stood still, shining the light around, trying to calm my breathing. Nothing. It was like whatever presence I felt out there just decided it was done with me. I didn't see any animal running off, no figure disappearing into the darkness. It was just gone, as if it had never been there in the first place. But I know I didn't imagine it. I remember the tension in the air, the strange pattern of stones, and that disturbing crack-like sound that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I didn't linger. I went straight back to my truck, got inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a good few minutes, heart pounding. Eventually, I drove back to town, headlights cutting through the quiet night. I've never been able to fully explain what I experienced that night. I never filed any report about it either, because what would I say? That I went looking for a lead and ended up spooked by something I couldn't see, something that moved rocks and made the wind shift strangely. I knew nobody would take me seriously, but from that night on, I couldn't look at that desert the same way. I avoided taking jobs that required going too far out alone after dark. I still think about what might have been watching me, some unknown creature that people claim exists, but that no one can quite prove. Maybe it really was a big, hairy thing lurking among the rocks, studying me from a safe distance, deciding I wasn't worth the trouble. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something we don't have a name for. To this day, I have no real answers. I know what I felt. I know that sense of dread was real, that the patterns in the dirt were real, and that sound was definitely real. Whatever it was, it let me go. It vanished into the night just as easily as it came, leaving me alone, confused and pretty shaken up. Even now, I get chills when I picture that quiet stretch of desert under the starlight, remembering how close I felt to something I still can't explain. Story 18. I remember that day in 1993 like it was yesterday. I was in Brookfield Hollow, Ohio, just a small, quiet town that never really made the news for anything exciting. At the time, I was working on my own, looking into old reports of weird stuff around the area. Nothing had ever really come of it, mostly just old rumors and local legends. But there was this abandoned stable on the outskirts of town that kept getting mentioned in a few old newspaper clippings, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a chilly day, late afternoon when I got there. The place was a couple of miles out of town, past some overgrown trails that weren't marked on any map I had. Walking out there, I remember how thick the brush was. Tall grasses, a few scrawny trees, and these weird berry bushes with twisted branches. The stable itself sat quiet and low, almost blending into the landscape. The wood was grey and old, like it had been left to rot decades ago. I had a backpack with me, just some basic supplies, a flashlight and a notepad. No phone signal, obviously. Back in '93, cell coverage out there was non-existent, so I knew I was basically on my own. I noticed something off the moment I got close. The wind around that stable made this strange sound, like a constant whisper. I know how that sounds, but it really felt like the breeze was carrying some sort of hush, not just rustling leaves. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. It's not unusual to feel uneasy in a deserted place, but this was different. I can't put my finger on it, but it was like stepping into someone else's space without being invited. I remember circling the building before getting too close. The wood was warped, and some of the boards had caved in. As I walked around, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the outside walls, there were these deep, long scratches. Not like an animal just digging around, These were huge and deliberate, way higher than what any normal animal around there could do. They looked like claw marks, maybe 3 or 4 broad slashes each time, gouged into the old planks. The wood splinters along the edges were fresh, lighter than the aged timber, suggesting something had done this not too long before I arrived. I ran my fingers near one of the marks, careful not to get a splinter, and I swear I could still smell something, maybe a faint, musky odor, clinging to them. I stood still for a minute, just listening. Nothing but that whispering wind and occasional creaks from the boards. No birds, no distant hum of traffic, nothing that would make me feel connected to the rest of the world. I felt exposed. I couldn't just walk inside that stable. It didn't have a clear path in or out. If something or someone was in there, I'd be trapped. My mind started racing with all the stories I'd heard. People talking about huge ape-like creatures seen around these parts way back in the 70s, strange sightings in the woods, unsettling howls late at night. Most people laughed them off as hoaxes, but standing there, I wasn't in a laughing mood. I decided not to enter, but I had to figure out if there were tracks or trails around. I moved slowly around the perimeter, taking care not to step on any sticks that might snap loudly. The ground was soft in places, patches of loose dirt and damp leaves. After a few minutes of searching, I found footprints, not human ones. They were broad, larger than my hand, with toes that dug into the soil. They weren't perfect impressions, some smudged by what must have been a weighty stride, but they were large enough to make my heart pound. I kept thinking, what the hell moves out here with feet like that? The smell got stronger too. A rotten, earthy stink, like damp fur mixed with old sweat. It seemed to come and go, carried on the breeze, always making me turn my head, expecting to see something big and hairy looming behind me. But I didn't see anything, just those tall grasses swaying, the stable's old wood sighing in the wind. At one point, I thought I heard something behind the stable, a low grunt or maybe a sniffing sound. I froze, listening hard. My mind tried to rationalize. Could be a deer, a bear, though bears weren't common in that region by that time, or some random animal. But I knew. Deep down, I felt it was something else, something that wasn't supposed to be there, or wasn't supposed to let me see it. My palms started sweating and my heart hammered. I tried to force a cough, to let whatever it was know that I was there. Maybe it would run away. Nothing happened. Just silence, broken only by that faint whispering wind. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was like having eyes on the back of my neck, making my skin crawl. I kept turning, trying to catch any hint of movement, any shape in the tall grass. But it's like the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. I remember thinking, just go. You have enough. You have the scratches, the footprints. You know something isn't right. But part of me wanted more proof, something I could show people. I guess I was too curious for my own good. I knelt down near the footprints and touched the soil. It felt moist, and when I lifted my fingers to my nose, I could still catch a whiff of that odd odor. I wiped my hand on my jeans and decided that was enough. I wasn't equipped to handle a confrontation with whatever made those marks. I didn't have a weapon, just a flashlight that suddenly felt useless in broad daylight. There was no way I was going to get inside that stable. If something wanted me gone, it was only a matter of seconds before it came out of hiding. As I stood up, I swear I saw a shape move behind a cluster of shrubs about 30 feet away. It was brief, just a shift in the foliage, but large enough to stand out. I focused my eyes, trying to pick out a form. Dark fur, maybe. I saw something tall, easily ahead above the vegetation, but before I could fully process it, it dipped down and vanished. My stomach flipped. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but I knew better. I've never been so sure I wasn't alone. I took a few steps back, keeping my eyes on that spot. Every muscle in my body tensed, expecting it to charge. But nothing happened. No sudden moves, no sound of branches snapping. It was as if it never existed. The stable behind me creaked again, and I almost jumped out of my skin. I realized how vulnerable I was. No one knew I was out here. There was no quick way back to the main road. If something happened, I was on my own. That's when I decided to leave. I made my retreat slowly, never turning my back fully to the stable area until I was halfway down the trail. Once I was sure I was out of immediate sight, I practically power-walked through the brush, tripping on roots and pushing branches out of my way. My heart didn't stop racing until I finally reached a more familiar dirt path closer to town. I never got a clear, detailed look at whatever was out there. I never saw a face, never heard a roar or a scream. But I know what I felt, and I know those marks and footprints weren't from any animal I'd seen before. They were from something bigger, something powerful enough to rip into wood and roam around that abandoned stable like it owned the place. When I got back to Brookfield Hollow, everything felt normal again. The sounds of cars, people chatting in front of the store, even a dog barking somewhere down the street. It all felt surreal, like I'd stepped back from another world. I tried to make sense of it, but what could I say? No one would believe me if I claimed I ran into something like a Bigfoot or a large, unknown creature. They'd say I was stirring up old legends. I didn't have pictures, samples, nothing concrete, just my word and my shaky memory. To this day, I can't fully explain what I encountered that afternoon. That stable is probably still there, rotting away, and maybe that thing is still lurking around the outskirts of Brookfield Hollow. All I know is, I felt watched. I smelled something foul and wild. I saw scratch marks no ordinary animal could have made, and I caught a glimpse of something big lurking in the brush. I've never gone back. Even now, looking back on it, I get chills. I've learned that not everything out there needs to be understood, and some places are better left alone. It happened, and then it ended, as abruptly as it began. And after all these years, it still haunts me. I don't think I'll ever have a good explanation for what I found, or what found me. Story 19. Back in 1994, I was working as a night watchman in Redfern Valley, Oregon. I'd just moved to the area a few months earlier, and that job seemed like an easy gig. The place I was guarding was this old abandoned warehouse, just an empty husk of what used to be some kind of factory. I never really got the full story on what they made there. The upper floors were half collapsed, the metal beams were rusted, and there were old machines stacked up in ways that didn't look safe at all. The whole building felt off, like it was holding its breath. Usually my nights there were quiet. Honestly, it was pretty boring work. I'd bring a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, a pack of cigarettes, and just do my rounds every couple of hours. Then I'd sit near the entrance and wait for my shift to end. This one night, though, something just felt different. It was one of those still nights where the air feels heavy. No wind, no rustle of leaves, nothing. It gave me this weird feeling in my chest. I remember checking my watch around midnight and heading out to do my usual walk-through. As I stepped into the main corridor, I heard something. Not a loud noise, just this muffled sound, like a dull thump or a shuffle. It echoed faintly in the darkness, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It didn't sound like rats, and believe me, I know what rats sound like. This was heavier, like something larger was moving but trying not to be heard. I tried to act normal, kept the flashlight low, scanning the floor and the corners. I didn't want to startle whatever it was. At first, I thought maybe a person had snuck in. The building was old, but maybe some local kids were messing around, or maybe a drifter looking for a place to sleep. I've kicked out a few squatters before, but then I noticed something strange. A few tools I had seen earlier were now moved. A metal wrench and a pry bar I knew had been tossed carelessly on a table were now placed in a neat line on the ground, just a few feet ahead of me. That detail sticks with me because it was so deliberate. Tools don't just get up and rearrange themselves. And if it was a person, why would they line them up like that? I remember how quiet it was. My own breathing sounded way too loud. I wanted to say something, maybe call out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something told me to stay quiet and just observe. I shined my flashlight around. Old crates, dust everywhere, a machine half covered by a dirty tarp. Nothing moved, but I felt something watching me, I swear to God. My neck prickled, the hair on my arms stood up. It was that unmistakable feeling of being watched, even though my eyes couldn't confirm anything. I decided to backtrack. I thought, screw being curious, I don't get paid enough for this. I turned around to head back toward the entrance, keeping my pace slow. As I did, I caught another sound. This time, it was like a deep grunt. Not super loud, but deep and throaty, coming from somewhere behind me or maybe above me. It wasn't human, at least not like any human I've ever heard. It reminded me a bit of a large animal, but I couldn't think of what would be inside this old factory. A bear. That made no sense. There was no food, and the place wasn't exactly bear-friendly. Besides, the grunt had a weird, almost questioning tone to it, like it knew I was there and was letting me know it didn't appreciate my presence. My hands were shaking, and I tried to steady the flashlight. The beam danced on the cracked concrete floor as I walked. Every few steps I'd stop and listen, and each time I stopped, I could hear something else shift, like it was staying just out of my line of sight. The whole place smelled musty, like old metal and mildew, but every now and then I caught a whiff of something earthy and damp. It's hard to describe, but it made me think of wet fur or a wild animal that's been sleeping in a hidden spot. At one point, as I neared the front of the building, I thought I saw movement on the upper level. The second floor had these twisted metal railings and broken concrete slabs. I just caught a brief glimpse of a shape, huge, dark, and moving quickly away from my flashlight beam. It was tall, hunched over, and definitely not human. I couldn't see details, but I know what a person looks like, and that wasn't a person. My heart just about stopped. I remember the chill that shot through my spine. I wanted to run, but I was afraid that sudden movement might provoke it. Instead, I just kept walking slowly, as if I didn't notice. My mind was racing. I'd heard stories around these parts, whispers of something roaming the forests, stories you laugh off when someone mentions them at the bar. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you give it. I never believed any of that before. But in that moment, I was ready to believe anything. I made it to the front door and stepped outside. The night air hit me, and I felt a surge of relief. Yet, I still sensed it. Whatever it was still inside, maybe watching me from one of those broken windows. I could almost imagine it silently stepping closer to the opening, blending with the darkness. My flashlight flickered. Old batteries. I remember cursing under my breath. I didn't have any backup batteries on me. I stood there for a second, trying to decide if I should lock up and just leave. But my job was to keep watch until morning, and I had to at least pretend to be doing what I was paid for. I lingered outside for a good 20 minutes, smoking a cigarette, just trying to calm down. I listened carefully. No howls, no screams, nothing dramatic like you'd see in a movie. Just that strange silence again. Eventually, I forced myself to go back in. My logic was that it must have slipped out somehow. Maybe it was gone. But inside, the silence felt charged. I did a quick sweep near the entrance. No new signs. The tools were still on the floor where I'd seen them. Nothing else seemed out of place. I sat on my stool near the front desk, barely breathing. There was this old desk with a single dim lamp. I kept that on. The rest of the building stayed pitch black, except for where my flashlight could reach. Every few minutes, I'd shine the light into the corridor. Nothing. No movement. The tension, though, was unreal. My heart wouldn't settle down. After maybe an hour of sitting there, tense and ready to bolt at any noise, I finally started to feel a bit more at ease. Maybe it really was gone. Then, just before the sky started to lighten, I heard a soft scuffling sound near the back of the building, where there was an old storage room. It wasn't loud, just a subtle scraping, like something large shifting its weight on the concrete floor. I stood up, heart pounding again. I pointed my flashlight that way, holding my breath. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The rest of the shift was torture. I stayed put near the front, didn't dare go exploring again. I counted down the minutes until dawn. When my relief finally arrived, I told him I was feeling sick and left early. I didn't mention what I saw. I mean, what could I say? Hey, I might have seen a huge creature rummaging around inside, taller than any man, and it rearranged some tools just to freak me out. That sounds ridiculous. People around here were polite, but I knew they'd think I was making it up or losing it. Still, I never shook off that feeling. I never found any proof, never saw it clearly enough to describe its face or anything, but I know what I felt. That sense of being hunted, or at least observed, by something that didn't want to be discovered. I finished my contract a few months later and never worked there again. To this day, I can't explain what was in that building with me. Maybe it was some drifter, maybe an animal that somehow got inside, but I doubt it. It felt bigger than that, more intelligent. To this day, when I think about that night, I get chills. I've never told anyone the full story, and I still have no idea what it really was. I just know I wasn't alone, and it wasn't human. After that night, I never looked at those old silent places the same way again. It happened, and then it stopped, as if it never existed at all. But I know what I felt, and I'll never forget it.